There was, as far as I could see, no way out. I had been caught red-handed and flat-footed, and I had no idea how to explain what Ogi had just seen. I did not know how long he had stood by the cedars watching as I swooped and spun around the boulder, so focused on running my calculations and, to be honest, so lost in the sensation of nearly flying once more, that I had completely forgotten to pay attention to the outside world. I had grown complacent and had foolishly assumed that a hiding spot only 450 meters from the school's entrance would be enough to keep my practice sessions secret. Of course Ogi would notice that I had slipped out and disappeared. Of course he would go out in search of me, as he was my self-appointed minder and co-leader of this training group. I must have been stupid to think otherwise, or really, to have not considered the possibility at all. And now I was paying for my idiotic behavior, standing on the stony bank of the frozen river, tongue-tied and shuffling my feet like the guilty child I suddenly felt like I was. What do I say to him? My mind, usually so quick and agile, had unaccountably fallen into disorder and had screeched to a grinding halt. I couldn't think, couldn't plan. All the ideas and strategies and plans that constantly whirled through my mind had deserted me. I couldn't explain it. I had been in all kinds of situations that had far higher stakes, when my own life and death had been on the line, and I had never frozen up like this, never felt so stunned and panicky. The closest I had come had been when I thought Naoto would reject me, tell me to leave the group. Then, the fear of suddenly being alone again had been overwhelming, but I'd still had ideas of how to convince him to change his mind, to reconsider. Ideas that had ultimately proven unnecessary, but that had nonetheless come to me immediately. And now, I couldn't even figure out whether I should tell the truth or lie, much less come up with anything close to believable. Should I run? The idea was nonsense, yet strangely appealing. Not having to explain one of the few secrets I still held close, the secret weapon that had seen me through thick and thin, that had kept my limbs moving when those around me collapsed, never to rise again. But then what? And where to? I couldn't do it. Panicked flight without a goal would burn my bridges and likely condemn me to a death by exposure or cold. For some reason, the first of those two probable outcomes felt like the worst of the pair. I suddenly realized that while I had been working myself up into an uncharacteristically indecisive froth, Ogi had slowly approached from the tree line, and was now only 2 arm lengths away. The initial shock still lingered, but an all too familiar concern was evident in the worried furrow of his brow and the set of his mouth. He paused in his approach as we made eye contact, and then slowly bent his knees, lowering himself down until he was nearly at eye level with me. "Tanya, are you okay?" Abruptly, I felt ashamed of my thoughts of flight or deception as I remembered a conversation around the battered old table back in Naoto's apartment. Back then, this same man had said, with all detectable sincerity, that I was needed. "Not just because of your raw ability, we need you for you." I had believed him then. Why was I suddenly so convinced that he would reject me now? I am afraid of being rejected, of being thought crazy? Well, I'm not a coward. Mustering up my courage, I opened my mouth and asked, "Ogi, do you believe in magic?" Ogi paused for a moment. "Magic? I can't say I've ever seriously thought about it, Tanya." For some reason, he looked even more worried than he had a moment earlier. I could understand why. If one of my co-workers in my first life had suddenly started talking about magic, I would have been worried that they'd snap too. That said, he'd just seen me hovering over the ground, so the skepticism seemed a bit rich at the moment. I took a deep breath. I've always known that there was something different about myself. Something that made me stand out from the other children at my school, and then the other refugees in the ghetto. I paused trying to figure out how to explain the next part. When the Britannians invaded and my mother moved us to Shinjuku, when I had to start working, I was able to draw on that special thing as a source of energy and strength. And that special thing was magic? Ogi frowned slightly at that, before speaking again, this time slowly, haltingly, clearly choosing each word with care. "And you can use this magic to strengthen yourself, and to fly?" I nodded, doing my best not to look too relieved. So far, he wasn't running for the hills or calling me crazy, although I suppose the second was harder to do if you'd seen magic with your own eyes. I don't truly know how it works, or what it is, but I don't have a better way to describe it than magic. I can use it to enhance my strength, my endurance, my reflexes, and my mental acuity. I can't use it to fly, though I might be able to someday, but I can use it to redirect what direction I am moving in and how fast I am going. I only recently figured that out, and I was practicing it when you interrupted me. Ogi smiled faintly at the mild note of reproach in my voice, before reaching out and tousling my hair. I stood still and endured it in stoic silence, rather than attempt flight or resistance, a small personal token of thankfulness that he had believed me, that he hadn't rejected me. "So, you're a real-life magical girl, huh?" His teasing tone belied the concern I still saw on his face, but that concern was steadily blending with awe and pride. Was it? "Do you have a special transformation sequence or anything? A small talking animal mascot, perhaps?" I endured the affection for as long as I could stand it, roughly 10 seconds, before applying my newly refined vector acceleration skills to scoot back a few feet, out of reach of any prospective head pats. I'm not running away from physical affection. I am strategically repositioning for a tactical advantage, damn it. "The only talking animal I see here is you, Ogi," I snapped, playing up the mock irritation while internally thankful that he'd managed to dispel the remaining awkwardness with humor. A valuable skill in a leader. I should try to learn it. Anyway, call it magic or something else if you can't keep a straight face about it. The point is, it gives me some limited tactical advantages. Ogi nodded his understanding. "Magic is fine. Sorry, it just took me by surprise to hear it." He sighed heavily and rubbed at his head, denting his already somewhat flattened pompadour. "I mean, I honestly don't know if I'd have believed it at all, if I hadn't seen you, practicing, for myself." He closed his eyes for a moment, before opening them with an air of renewed determination. "All right, so, magic. What do you need to be effective?" I blinked, mildly surprised at how fast Ogi had gone from confusion to acceptance. Ogi clearly caught the momentary flicker of surprise, and smiled wryly. "You're already plenty special without magic, Tanya. I decided to try and stop being surprised when you pull out some fresh piece of insanity and just go along with it. It's better for my liver that way." I snorted at that, remembering multiple nights I'd helped tuck a drunken Ogi, or Naoto, or both, into bed, pulling their boots off and making sure that a glass of water was near at hand for whenever they woke up with a headache. I'd personally never been much of a fan of alcohol, especially not to the point of drunkenness, but I wasn't going to begrudge anybody the minor luxuries it took to get through the Shinjuku day. "Good, it'd be a shame if your liver failed before you hit 35, old man. Don't you know that we don't offer health care for lifestyle issues? Call me insane, would he? Ha." Ogi theatrically clutched his chest for a second, before laughing and letting his hand drop to his side. I just hope I live long enough for death by cirrhosis to take me." The smile stilled for a moment, a pensive expression momentarily on his face, before Ogi shook off the darkness. "Anyway, do you need anything for your magic to work? Any, mana crystals or anything?" This time, I laughed. "What, like a video game? Where the hell would I be buying crystals out here?" I had a sudden image of a man who looked a lot like Captain Yuga from the old Logistical Corps, only dressed like a stereotypical wizard, and snorted with amusement. "No, all I need is food. Food, and more muscle." Ogi lit up at that. So it's somehow tied to your body's reserves? And as your stamina improves, so does your magical capacity?" I nodded and tried to avoid slipping into my instructor's voice. "Yes, exactly. Thanks to you, I've had more time to eat, so I've had more caloric intake, which has helped promote muscle development. In turn, this has increased my magical capacity, allowing me to investigate new applications. I realized I had failed in my attempt. I was helpless to resist the cadence of the classroom, and only barely managed to force my mouth closed, halting the flow of detail. Thankfully, Ogi came to the rescue a moment later, filling the sudden silence as I resisted the impulse to vomit forth more detail about a topic near and dear to my heart after years of secret keeping. "New applications, eh? Well, sounds like it's a great idea to keep you fed. Which, come to think of it, is why I went looking for you anyway. The new arrivals are mostly done setting up, and Nagata was organizing dinner when I left. How about we get out of the cold and get some food before the guys eat it all?" March 17, 2016 ATB, the school training facility. Today was my birthday, a fact I hadn't bothered to share with anybody. The anniversary of my birth had even less emotional weight in this life than in my previous two, as my mother had been too poor, too distant, and too drunk to ever do much to celebrate it. It hadn't bothered me as a child, and while I now regret not trying harder to get to know the woman who kept me alive for all those years, who had done her best to support my educational aspirations, not celebrating my birthday didn't bother me much now either. As such, I had expected today to be much like yesterday, busy, but comparatively uneventful. Somehow, Ogi had learned it was my birthday, and had conspired with Nagata to smuggle a hot rotisserie chicken and a small can of coffee with filters into our shared room. I had no idea how the two had managed this achievement, but when I returned to the dorm room there they were. The two fools had tried to refuse any of the chicken, but I had insisted. I didn't want them to think I was a food hoarder, after all. In the small but cramped confines of hungry Shinjuku, hoarding food from family and friends was taboo, as it represented a willingness to prioritize oneself over the collective good. After much effort, I managed to foist a breast and a wing off onto each man, saving my favorite parts for myself and carefully forgetting to offer either man any of my coffee. Some sacrifices were too weighty to bear. It was the best birthday of my third life to date. I hoped all three of us would live for at least another year, so I could celebrate with Naoto, Kallen, Ino and Tamaki next time. April 4, 2016 ATB, the school training facility. The long-awaited arrival of spring in Gunma Prefecture coincided almost perfectly with the graduation of the first class of trainees. It was amazing, after so long in urban environments, to see how dramatic the seasonal change was out in the hilly backcountry. All around the school skeletal deciduous trees suddenly erupted in green buds, and the deep snow diminished and retreated to the shadows of the evergreens. The fields turned to mud, the returning birds chirped, and Major Inoda continued to complain about how the recruits were being coddled. Thankfully, despite Inoda's grousing, he had managed to impart a number of valuable skills to the trainees over the last 3 months, offering badly needed insight and first-hand experience into the arts of signal intelligence and infiltration. Inoda had also made an arguably even more valuable contribution to their training. He had managed to instill a sense of patience in even the most hot-headed of the recruits, who were now capable of lying prone in a puddle of mud for hours on end without movement or complaint. Combined with the hours each man and woman had spent on the range familiarizing themselves with the captured Britannian assault rifles and pistols as well as the thorough grounding all 60 had received in ambush tactics, the first cohort had emerged from their training as theoretically expert irregular fighters. Coupled with the lessons on how to repair and sabotage machines, how to drive, how to provide life-saving first aid, and on close-quarters combat, the cohort would have looked extremely promising on paper, if anything that happened at the school was actually recorded in any form. Despite the wide range of skills, Major Inoda continued to insist on a graduation test. Worryingly, he had actually come to our latest meeting with an argument other than tradition. When push comes to shove, Miss Hajime, most people simply don't have the will to kill. After I had demonstrated my proficiency with small arms and close-quarters combat to his satisfaction, Major Inoda deigned to speak directly to me, although his tone when we met for our weekly one-on-one meeting remained insufferable. It is unfortunate, but many soldiers simply lack the warrior spirit. The sneer was quite incredible, especially compared to the JLF liaison's typically expressionless mien. They shoot over the heads of the enemy, they don't close for combat, they offer mercy. Inoda shook his head, looking for all the world like a disappointed teacher who had grown used to the stupidity of his students. These are not true soldiers. They are perhaps capable of support, maybe garrison duty, but are not capable of true soldiering. But unconsciously, he leaned in slightly, and I could see the glint of an enthusiasm and interest that went far beyond the professional in his eyes. But if you force them to kill, to do up close so they can feel the blood on their hands, their enemy's hot breath on their face, and if you make them do it in front of their buddies, well, nobody likes to be the screw-up in the squad. That's how you make sure your recruits will actually serve the cause. I nodded my agreement. Peer pressure was an excellent motivator, for better or worse, and I was certain that Inoda was at least partially correct in his assessment that forcing men to kill made it easier for them to kill again in the future. That said, the way that Inoda persisted in bringing this topic up over and over again all but proved that this was a personal matter, something that Inoda considered a vitally important part of training. I wonder if the rest of the JLF agrees? I understand your point, Major Inoda. Unfortunately, The logistical problems with the concept remain unchanged from the last time we discussed this topic. I paused for a moment. Out of curiosity, Major, does the JLF still maintain this tradition? I haven't heard of many Britannians vanishing without a trace, certainly not in batches. Onoda winced slightly, and sagged a little. Unfortunately, General Kotase, in his wisdom, has prohibited blooding training after the honored Colonel Todo expressed reservations. Besides, his mouth twisted as if he'd bit into something rotten, his thin mustache twisting with his lips. The Japanese Liberation Front has not pursued a vigorous recruitment policy over the last several years, which has rendered the matter moot, for now at least. He sighed and shook his head with dismay. The wisdom of that choice I understand. We already have too many men sitting in bunkers, unwilling to take the fight to the enemy. I blinked, taking care to conceal any other evidence of my surprise. This was by far the most talkative mood I had ever caught Onoda in, and it was the most he had ever said about the inner politics of the JLF in my hearing. But you have been active. You said that you had been in Fukushima Prefecture, scouting the new Maglev rail branch. Why weren't you sitting in a bunker too? Something about that made Onoda perk back up. It's all thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe. Kami willing, he is the future of the Japanese Liberation Front. He is the only divisional commander willing to take an aggressive stance against the foreign invader. Onoda paused, smiled, and continued on more calmly. He is also my superior officer. Most of us still willing to take the fight to the Britannians are under his command. That was a very interesting tidbit. It sounded like General Kotase, who I'd learned from previous conversations was the overall commander of the JLF, had opted to cut down on his headaches by lumping all of his problem children together in one unit. Frankly, that only sounded like a good idea to me if his plan was to use said unit as an expendable division, one that would take the most casualties and be given only the most risky assignments. No point in saying as much to Onoda, though. That actually brings me to another question, Major, and feel free to not answer it if it breaks operational security, I began, carefully injecting a note of respectful deference, and lowering my head a carefully metered degree for a moment. But what sort of operations does the JLF conduct to further the goal of liberating Japan? No need for specifics, but can you describe any examples? Onoda did not immediately respond, instead studying me silently. His typically expressionless mask had returned, as had the familiar flat eyes that betrayed nothing of the Major's inner thoughts. I kept quiet as the silence dragged uncomfortably onward. Eventually, some inner calculation must have been completed, as Onoda opened his mouth and began to speak. His tone was calm, his voice level, but I could almost feel the man's frustration. General Kotase has decreed that in order for Japan to one day be liberated, we must preserve and build our strength, and mislead the Britannians into the false impression that we will never act, until the day to spring our accumulated might upon them and drive them from glorious Japan comes at last. As such, most of our official missions are towards that end, accumulating resources and intelligence, cultivating strength, and luring the Britannians into complacency. Onoda fell silent, licking his lips for a moment, before resuming. We now have bunkers and storerooms full of enough supplies to last our garrisons for years, more weapons than men to use them, listening posts near every radio tower in Japan and taps on practically every phone line. And yet, we do not attack. We barely even recruit. I worry that the Britannians have not been the only ones to be misled into the belief that the day of liberation will never come. I nodded gravely. Onoda hadn't really answered my question, but he hadn't needed to. I could draw the obvious lines between the dots myself. The JLF's leadership had lost the will to fight, in Onoda's eyes, and had instead opted to continue kicking the can down the road. The only faction in the JLF that was still active in the world outside their bunkers was apparently Kusakabe's group. I had noticed the emphasis Onoda had put on specifying that he was only speaking about officially sanctioned missions, considering that Kusakabe's division was apparently where the most aggressive and willing to fight were sent. I could only wonder at the scope of his unofficial missions. It occurs to me, I began carefully, realizing that I was far out onto thin ice at this point, that we might be able to help each other. I paused, but Onoda didn't respond in any visible manner, so I continued. I still owe 2 missions for your organization, to be conducted upon targets that you specify. If, perhaps, one of those missions involved damaging the Britannian communication network by, say, taking over a radio station, Perhaps some messaging informing the Japanese public that the JLF is seeking new members and that the day of liberation is near at hand could somehow be broadcast before the station is destroyed? Onoda's breath hissed out, but he still looked as expressionless as ever. Then, a somewhat detached, thoughtful look came over him, and he pointedly turned slightly to the side, looking out through the window of the empty classroom. It would be exceedingly unfortunate, in General Kotasei's point of view, if an irregular group unconnected to the Japanese Liberation Front, in their enthusiasm, aired such a message. Onoda nodded at nothing in particular, and turned back to look at me. There is an FM station in Niigata Prefecture, one I have been to before. I will be speaking about the basics of operating the transmission equipment I observed there in an hour. Please use your discretion about how you choose to share this information. In the meantime, I will be recording a short message for my own amusement. I frequently forget to remove the CD from the machine after I finish recording. I nodded again, and stood up from the cushion I had been kneeling upon. Onoda couldn't have been clearer if he tried. If this mission was successful, I would have done his faction a favor and partially paid off my debt to the JLF in the process. If I failed, on the other hand, Onoda would claim that it had been a rogue operation. Guess Gekoko is alive and well in the JLF. What a surprise. April 7, 2016 ATB, Minami Uenuma, Niigata. 1437. Minami Uenuma had been, before the conquest, a prosperous medium-sized city of 50,000. Its inhabitants had relied upon the abundant and productive paddy fields that churned out the famous Koshi Hikari variety of rice for summer season income. In the winter, its steep snows and ski resorts had drawn tourists from all over Japan, and occasionally even from abroad. In essence, Minami Uenuma had been an up-and-coming provincial burg, a place where little that was newsworthy happened, a safe place for pensioners to settle or for young families to be raised in mixed agrarian-urban bliss. Now, rolling into Minami Uenuma in the back of an illicitly acquired van, I could only mourn the sheer waste, the mismanagement that every meter of Minami Uenuma bore, the same scars that every village, town, or city I had traveled through so far had borne. Over the last day, my team and I had traveled through Naganohara, Nakanojo, Takayama, Numata, Minakami, and Yuzawa, plus half a dozen nameless villages. From a street-level view, it was impossible to miss the number of shuttered shops, the buildings gutted by fire and left to rot, and of course, the number of walls with lines of clearly visible bullet holes at chest height. It was clear that under the burden of Britannian occupation, rural Japan was dying. The vitality and produce were sucked away by distant landlords and governors, whose rule on the ground was enforced both by civilian overseers and managers and by the small Britannian garrisons and honorary Britannian police forces scattered across the interior. Nobody was in much of a mood to talk, that was clear enough from the mood in the van. Nagata was stone-faced behind the wheel, dressed in the livery of the same delivery service that we had stolen the van from. The other 8 men and 2 women, 2 squads of the newly graduated cohort, also sat in a silence heavy with tension. I could imagine what they were thinking about, but only just barely. It had been so long, literally a lifetime ago, since the first time I had gone into battle. Idly, I wondered if I had actually gotten off lightly. In that regard at least, I had not expected to be fighting for my life when I'd gone up into the northern sky, and that sudden plunge into battle had been a nearly complete surprise, sprung on me with only a minute's warning. By contrast, these 2 squads, the best of the first training cohort, had known for 3 days what was coming. Had it haunted them, the knowledge that their lives might be over in days hanging over every waking hour and dreaming minute? Impossible to know for sure, but I suspected that it had. While every man and woman, and child, in Shinjuku had walked side by side with death for the last half-decade, the terror of one's own mortality had never truly numbed, at least not for me. And I knew that there was at least the possibility of life after death, but there was something in the void, asinine though that something may be. Well, I'm the leader. It's up to me to get them into the best shape, morale-wise, instead of letting them stew in their anxieties. Let's go over the plan once more, I said, deliberately breaking the silence. Immediately, every head except Nagata's in the van turned towards me. I smiled back at them, taking the time to look from person to person, making eye contact with each of my brand new baby comrades. First, I want you all to know that I am proud of you. Start with the praise, it gets the audience receptive. You all have done a superb job on your training. Now, You will have the opportunity to put your new skills into practice. I reached into the rucksack at my feet, and pulled out a jewel box, containing an unlabeled CD, and held it up for their inspection. Our job is to get in, get this message from the JLF broadcast, and get out, preferably destroying the CD and the radio station as we do so. I smiled at my captive audience again, drawing their eyes back to me from the CD. Of course, it is not going to be so simple, nor so easy. I suspect the Britannians might take an unkind view to our choice of alternative programming. After the pity chuckle died down, I turned my attention to the particulars. As far as we are aware, there are two groups of opposing forces active in the region. The Minamunuma Municipal Police Department, which is primarily staffed with honorary Britannians with minimal training and armed exclusively with clubs, has between 300 and 350 officers. On the other hand, the Goon Squad, the private security force, hired by the local landlord's property management society, consists of between 50 and 80 Britannian veterans equipped with small arms and in possession of 2 ex-military armored personnel carriers. This was hardly a surprise, as they'd all heard the plan before, but the numbers were admittedly daunting. I didn't begrudge them the clenched jaws, the darting eyes, the overwhelming nervous tension. This might sound like a lot, but a ton of garbage is still garbage, which is what they are. A bunch of practically untrained collaborators armed with sticks, whose job up until now has been terrorizing farmers into working, and some mercenaries only interested in their next paycheck are garbage. The beauty of it was that I barely had to spin the facts. The mercenary Britannians might be formidable, but I doubted any of them was eager to die for the local landlord. They lack unity of command, and they have no idea that we're coming. I turned to the leader of Squad 1, a fairly tall man in his early 30s named Yoshi, who was unfortunately experiencing early balding. Squad 1, what are your tasks? Yoshi coughed slightly, uncomfortable with suddenly being put on the spot, before responding. You will drop us off near the Shizawa station, along with our gear. We'll plant the first package by the station, and then head through the underpass to the north and keep going for a mile. The mercenaries and their APCs are headquartered at the old ski resort in the hills there. We are to set the second package on Prefectural Route 124 where it turns. When the first APC comes through, we blow the bomb. I nodded and gestured for him to continue. Heartened, Yoshi resumed his recitation. If the APC is stopped, we fire the RPGs at it in the second one. If any men get out, we open fire and fall back across the rice paddies, through the farms. We keep drawing them after us until you give us the word, then we find a car and get north to the meeting point in Shizuoka, behind the recycling plant. I nodded. Remember, your job is to be a highly mobile annoyance, not to be heroes. If you can kill their armor, or render them immobile, you will have done an excellent job. If you cannot, though, let me know immediately and fall back. I cast my eyes around the crowded van. That goes for all of you. Japan needs living soldiers far more than dead heroes. That said, I closed my eyes for a moment, and continued, that said, if you think you are going to be taken prisoner, I strongly recommend you make your own way out. I think you've all seen the photos from Christmas, right? All 9 men and 2 women, Nagata included, nodded at that. Good, they all know the stakes. Too late to back out now, anyway. Onoda would be furious. I turned to Tsubuki, the leader of Squad 2. She smiled manically as she met my eyes, nervous excitement practically rolling off her as she squirmed in her car seat. Before I could even prompt her, she began reciting Squad 2's planned role, the words pouring out in a vomiting froth. After you and Nagata park the van and get out, we're supposed to wait inside until the 2 of you go into the radio station, and then we're gonna hop out of the van all at once and book it west and south to the city hall, and we're going to kill everybody we can in that building, hopefully getting the mayor and chief of police too. But we gotta be fast, because we need to be back at the van 5 minutes later so we can hop in when you and Nagata head out of the station, unless we wanna stay behind when you guys go. Tsubuki took a deep breath as she reached the end, having recited the entire plan without stopping for breath. I frowned, but nodded. She had recited everything correctly, and in training exercises she'd been calm and collected under pressure. Seems like turning into a chatterbox is how she deals with the pre-mission jitters. I looked out the window as Nagata took a left, and saw a sign for Prefectural Route 365. So we'll be coming up on Shizawa Station in a minute. Excellent work, all of you. Remember to keep in contact, keep your heads on a swivel, and don't let them take you alive. For the rising sun. For Japan. April 7, 2016 ATB, Minami Uenuma, Niigata. 1449. Nagata smoothly pulled the van into a street-side parking space 10 meters away from the radio station, neatly checking that he was within the painted lines before killing the engine. Adjusting the cap of his delivery man outfit, he clambered out of the driver's side door, an empty cardboard box in his hands. I slipped out after him, Ogi's old, much-abused black hoodie concealing the pistol and the knife that pressed firmly against my belly. I had been pleasantly surprised, earlier this morning, when I found that the hoodie that had once nearly swallowed me up was now only somewhat baggy. Of course, the better fit did have a downside as well. It's good to finally not be a stick anymore, but there's less room to hide weapons now. As we approached the radio station, Nagata leading and me lurking in his shadow, I reached into my pocket and pressed the transmit button of the handheld radio I carried 3 times. I was relatively sure that Squad 1 would be able to receive the transmission at their planned location 3.5 kilometers away, but I hadn't been able to test the effects of Minami Uenuma's buildings on the walkie-talkies in advance. Too late to worry about that now. I was certain that Squad 2's radios had just clicked the signal, though, so in a few seconds they'd be boiling out of the van. The station was only a few meters away, and I was happy to see that the staff had apparently chosen to draw the curtains today, presumably in an attempt to keep out the afternoon sun. Happily for us, that meant that, aside through the glass of the front door, no curious passers-by would be able to look through the windows and see what was going on inside the station. That removes one source of potential complications, only a few hundred more to go. Nagata fumbled slightly with his package as he opened the glass door to the station lobby, pretending that it contained something heavy to draw the attention of the woman seated behind the receptionist's desk. She half stood, clearly trying to decide whether or not to get up and help him with the package, when I slipped out from behind Nagata, gun in hand. Before she had a chance to register what she was seeing, I fired once, twice, thankful that the coil gun pistol produced a tiny report compared to the deafening bellow of chemical propellant ignition. Nagata threw the box aside and rushed in, drawing the combat knife whose sheath had been tucked into the back of his belt as he headed left towards one of the 2 doors flanking the receptionist's desk. I spun to the right, covering the lobby with the arc of my pistol, looking for any waiting visitors sitting in the collection of ancient folding chairs. Fortunately, there were none, and so I completed my revolution back to the door, which was just closing behind us. As I flicked the lock closed a small measure, but one hopefully adequate to hold casual guests at bay, I saw Tsubuki emerging from the side door of the delivery van, assault rifle cradled in her arms. She's a bit early, I probably should have waited until we were at the door to twitch the radio. I hope the remote detonated pipe bomb that ideally Squad 1 had already planted a twin of the ones I had used in Shinjuku, and likewise sourced from Mr. Asahara during the frantic 2 days of prep was detonating successfully at just this moment. If not, we'll be drowning in municipal police in minutes. The plan rested on 2 pillars, speedy mobility, and the exploitation of the widely dispersed and poorly organized opposition forces. The police, armed only with batons, could still swarm my better-armed insurgents under with their huge numbers, but they were already spread across the municipality and 3 stations. I hoped the explosion at the train station would draw the bulk of the officers from the southern station, as well as some from the station closer to the center of the city. The attack by Squad 2 on the City Hall was likewise geared to attract the attention of the police away from the radio station, our true target. I doubted that they would be able to react fast enough to get here in sufficient number. The true purpose of the Honorary Britannian Municipal Police was to terrorize the local farmers into productivity, not to take the lead on fighting hostile forces, but if they did, hopefully they would concentrate on the more numerous and better armed force that would soon be machine gunning the local bureaucrats and anybody unlucky enough to be visiting the permits office this afternoon. My real concern was the private security force assembled by the Property Management Society. If they managed to get those APCs into town to respond to the attack on City Hall or to stop the broadcast of Major Onoda's message, never mind the bulk of their company-level strength, it would make extraction very difficult. Hopefully Squad 1's explosive ambush, complete with the use of another pipe bomb on the road most likely to be used if the mercenaries were dispatched to Minami Uenuma, would prevent their arrival entirely, or at least delay it until it was far too late. A gurgling scream indicated that the receptionist was apparently still alive. Turning from the door, I began running the calculations for my enhancement suite, making sure to pace my energy expenditure. Easily vaulting over the desk, I landed foot first on her face. The gurgle deepened as the fragments of her jaw were smashed down into her throat, but a second stomp on her neck soon muted even that sound. One down. Major Onoda's information had indicated a likely staff of 4 or 5 honorary Britannians, overseen by a Britannian manager and accompanied by a Britannian newsreader. 5 or 6 to go. I burst through the door to the right of the reception area, and found myself in a short hallway. There were 2 doors that looked like they opened onto restrooms at the far end of the hall to my left, a door marked janitorial to the right, a door marked office next, and finally a thick door with 2 light panels hanging over it, one of which was glowing a bright red. Presumably, the studio. Movement twitched in the left corner of my vision and I turned on my heel, bringing my pistol up to track the motion only to force my wrists back down towards the ground. Nagata emerged from the men's room, hands practically dripping with blood. Guy was at the sink, he grunted, noticing my curious look, thought I was coming in to use the urinal until I grabbed his hair. He rubbed at a spot on the left side of his abdomen, right below the ribs, and winced at the touch. Fucker kept ramming his elbow into me the whole damned time. Only stopped when I was nearly to the spine. I winced sympathetically. I knew from experience that the frenzied last burst of strength could be quite something, and the floating ribs bruised something awful. Did you check the women's room? Nagata nodded. Nobody was there, all the stalls were open. Well, unless they're in the janitor's closet. I turned and pointed my pistol at the door to the office. 4 or 5 to go. Let's get on with it, we're on the clock. I walked over to the door and moved to the side, keeping my pistol trained on the door in case someone inside decided to take a leak. Without prompting, Nagata came up, grabbed the handle, and in one fluid motion heaved it wide open and flung himself to the side, keeping one hand on the handle. Glad to see the room-to-room training stuck. Inside were 3 men, 2 obviously honorary Britannian bent over soundboards and other esoteric equipment, moving dials and sliders. Standing over them was an equally obvious Britannian, nearly bald save for a few strands of brown hair combed over his pate and incredibly fat. He was the first to turn towards the sudden surprise interruption, mustache already bristling and face purpling with indignant rage. I could tell the exact instant that he realized that I wasn't some lost member of the general public as his eyes abruptly widened, locked on the pistol in my hand, a pistol already raised and pointed at his center of mass. 3 shots, and the fat manager was reeling backwards, squealing like a pig, blood pumping from the triangle of holes punctured through his chest. Missed the heart, probably got a lung, might have nicked his vena cava, judging by the lack of arterial spurt. As he stumbled backwards, I followed him deeper into the office. As I followed the flailing Britannian, I passed the first honorary Britannian technician, still at his desk. The unfortunate man had looked up from his control board at the shots, which were presumably muffled by the headphones he wore, and screaming had made a desperate attempt to stand and wrench the bulky pair of wired headphones off his ears. Sadly for him, the escape attempt was defeated by his chair, which had snagged on the ratty carpet as he'd tried to push it out and away from the desk. This cruel stroke of misfortune left him trapped for a crucial second under his desk, unable to stand more than halfway up out of his chair and entirely unable to flee. The knife smashed through the honorary Britannian's C3 vertebra and sank deep into his neck, the 6-inch blade severing his spinal cord and almost certainly impaling his trachea as it tracked downwards through the dense column of muscle, propelled nearly hilt-deep by my supernaturally enhanced strength. With a heave, I wrenched the instrument back out of his nape as I continued to advance into the office. Ignoring Fatty the Britannian for a moment, I fired 3 times at the other honorary Britannian technician, who had made a nonsensical and panicked attempt to burrow under his desk. He screamed as one of the small caliber bullets sliced across his lower back, but he had chosen his strategy well. The other 2 bullets impotently thudded into the desk's wall. I fired the last shot of the magazine into the manager where he sat, slumped against the polished pine of the far wall, just in case he was still alive. I saw through the one-way glass of the office that Nagata had managed to find the last of our expected targets in the recording studio. The Britannian news presenter was desperately trying to ward him off, and had apparently met with some brief success, judging by the defensive wounds on her hands. A particularly nasty injury indicated that she had tried to catch the knife at one point, and had only gotten a split finger web halfway to her wrist for her trouble. As I hauled the technician out from under his desk, Nagata grew impatient and simply kicked the table she had sat at onto her, before following her down to the floor and out of my sight. The technician screamed as I flung him onto his desk, and I winced at the sounds of complicated destruction coming from the technology beneath him. Hopefully that wasn't anything important. "I would like to play a CD over the broadcast," I informed him, knife at his throat. "Can you please tell me where I should insert it and how to set it to broadcast?" He only burbled incoherently, eyes wide and pleading, and fixed on my knife. Too scared to talk is useless. Besides, he is an honorary, not a Britannian. Honey's worth a try. I moved the knife an inch further away from the technician's neck, and tried sweet reason. "What's your name?" He only screamed again, eyes still fixed on the admittedly gory instrument, so I slapped him as lightly as possible, just to get his attention. Thankfully, it worked, and his eyes goggled at me, full of horror. "What's your name, mister?" I asked again, trying to pitch my voice in a lighter tone to hopefully set him as much at ease as was possible under the circumstances. For a second, I thought the honorary Britannian wouldn't answer, but then, after swallowing, he managed to force out a mumbled Edward. "Mom." That wouldn't work. I needed to form common ground with him, which required sincerity. Not that name. I paused, surprised by the snap in my voice, and carefully modulated my tone back towards conversational. I heard something thump against the glass behind me, but ignored it. "Not that name, your real name. What's your real name?" Masanobu. "My name's Masanobu." I smiled down at him. Finally, progress. "All right, Masanobu. It's a pleasure to meet you." Now, as I was saying, I holstered the empty gun, keeping the knife hovering an inch away from his neck, and pulled out the jewel case containing Onoda's CD. "I want to broadcast this for all the world to hear. I am fairly certain that I can figure out how to do so without your help, but I am pressed for time. Would you please show me how to play this?" Masanobu was nodding even before I finished speaking. In a different setting, it might have looked comical. I carefully took a step to the side, giving him room to stand while keeping the knife near enough that he'd remember it. "Excellent. Please, lead the way." With effort, Masanobu rose on trembling feet, turned towards the workstation the first tech was slumped over, and promptly let out another scream. I suppose between the body of his coworker, the bloody smear down the other side of the one-way glass, and the sight of Nagata entering the office looking absolutely drenched in blood, it was an alarming sight, but unfortunately I was on the clock and had no time to be gentle. I rammed a fist straight into the shallow bullet wound that crossed his lower back, marveling at how the bullet had just barely creased the skin over his spinal column as I did so. "This guy's got some incredible luck. You were going to show me how to play the CD over the airwaves, Mr. Masanobu." I reminded him as he hunched forwards defensively. Nagata raised an eye at the tech's survival, but shrugged and started pulling off his drenched deliveryman uniform shirt. Sobbing, the technician walked forward towards the workstation, and after I heaved the corpse out of the way pointed out the CD slot where they inserted discs for music, explained how to start playing a disc, and what button I needed to press to transmit the audio out over the station's assigned FM band. I followed his instructions and Nagata pulled on the headphones abandoned by the first technician to check. Fortunately, he gave me a big thumbs up. Major Onoda's message was being broadcast to the world, or at least, to the listening audience of Niigata Prefecture. "People of Japan," I could hear from the discarded headphones lying on top of the CD player as I drove the knife up through the base of Masanobu's skull into his brain. "A quick death as a thank you. He didn't even live to feel it. The day of liberation will soon be upon us. We have endured a long and painful 6 years since the conquest of our glorious republic, but take heart. The Japan Liberation Front yet stands. We have spent this time building our strength, biding our time. Soon, like a tsunami, we shall wash away the Britannians and all of their evil. Soon, the land of the gods shall be pure once more." I pulled the first of the 2 pipe bombs out of the rucksack and wedged it squarely against the CD player as Major Onoda continued to prophesy the coming of a new Japan via the headset. I wanted to make sure that the CD was destroyed and the station rendered at least temporarily unusable when we left, to prevent the authorities from immediately declaring it a hoax or whatnot. "If you will fight, The Major's voice continued as Nagata wedged the second device into a box of what looked like important wires. "Join us. Join the JLF. Together we shall be a holy army, a force not seen since the kamikaze. And like the kamikazes that saved Japan from foreign invaders before, we shall save our beloved country once more. A new empire shall rise. Amaterasu's line shall again sit the chrysanthemum throne." "Time to go," I said to Nagata, and he nodded his assent. I clicked the portable radio's transmission dial once, pause twice, pause, and then once more. Nagata was already at the door of the blood-soaked office, and I followed him out the swinging door and into the little hallway. As we hit the reception area, I could hear the sounds of screams and automatic gunfire through the curtained windows, sounds that were steadily getting nearer. Squad 2's falling back. Suddenly remembering the locked front door, I dipped into my vector acceleration and zoomed right past Nagata before returning to a more natural flat-out sprint to the front door. I clicked the lock open just as Nagata bulled into the door, flinging it wide open and bouncing it off the rubber-tipped door stopper. I was less than a step behind, thankful that the inch of growth I had achieved since Callan and I had fled the ruins of a collapsing train station had lengthened my pace slightly. Nagata jumped into the driver's seat and twisted the key in the ignition as I threw open the side door of the van and tumbled inside. Leaving the door wide open, I frantically pulled out my pistol and fumbled for a fresh mag, slamming the reload home as Nagata pulled out into the street. Ahead, I could see Squad 2 leapfrogging down the street towards us, 3 members facing the way they came, laying down suppressing fire, 2 orienting towards us before one of the rear 3 fell back and the squad cycled. So good to see solid training in action. Skidding into the intersection, Nagata came screeching to a halt, which thankfully provided all the guidance Squad 2 needed. I squirmed my way up to the front passenger seat just in time to avoid a stampede of heavily armed gunmen, panting with exertion as the last man, or woman, actually, seeing how it was Tsubaki, slammed the side door behind them. "They're all in," I yelled at Nagata, "get going already." This was entirely unnecessary, as Nagata was already accelerating, fishtailing the van around a burning car halfway onto the sidewalk. Putting pedal to the metal, the van shot up Prefectural Route 17 heading north. As we skidded up the block and shot through the traffic light of the next intersection with reckless abandon, I pulled out the 2 burner phones that had accompanied Mr. Asahara's handiwork and dialed the only numbers in the contact list before throwing both out the window of the van. Despite the pounding of the wind through the open window, the explosive warmth was unmistakable, especially coupled with the sounds of shattering windows. It seems that the curtains weren't sufficiently thick to be bomb-proof. As Nagata turned onto a smaller outlet road and slowed to the speed limit, I let out a small sigh of relief. No sirens were audible, and surprisingly nobody seemed to even be looking askance at a van trundling its way down a feeder road towards Prefectural Route 253. If we can break contact, our side of the mission will have gone perfectly. Hopefully, Squad 1 can say the same. April 7, 2016 ATB, Shizuoka, Niigata. 1537. From my seat under the sheltering foliage of a cedar about 2/3 up the hill behind the Shizuoka Recycling Center and Municipal Incinerator, I was suddenly struck by the beauty of the broad Wono River valley spread out before me. A broad expanse of paddies, already green with the juvenile shoots of newly planted rice, broken only by the occasional farm or cluster of small buildings huddled around a crossroads. The simple pastoral scene seemed a world away from the claustrophobic streets of Shinjuku, to say nothing of my memories of mud and blood and thundering artillery. I stretched, my bare arms reaching out towards the rural scenery as my unshod feet pushed against the springy grass underfoot. Behind me, my sweatshirt was hung out to dry on one of the cedar's branches, dripping with river water after an impromptu wash to try and scrub out the worst of the blood. My shoes likewise sat in a patch of sunlight, now mostly free of the receptionist's remains. It was a bit brisk, sitting out here in only a tank top and trousers. Winter still hadn't fully released its grasp on the mountains, and come night the temperature would drop below freezing once more, but after so long cooped up in the van, not to mention the exertions of the day, the cool air felt luxurious. I could hear splashing coming from the creek running down the hill from some hidden spring as Nagata did his best to salvage his garments and the members of Squad 2 did their best to likewise clean themselves off. I sighed. Try as I might, it was impossible to shift the fact that, even now, 3 of my comrades were engaged in a desperate game of cat and mouse in the foothills to the southeast, from my mind for even a moment. No amount of pastoral scenery nor the crisp near-bliss sensitivity that came from surviving yet another conflict situation could distract me from the fact that my job was not done yet, that fighters under my command were still trying to break contact with the enemy. No amount of cool air and warm grass could distract me from the fact that, for the first time in this life, people I had led into battle were dead. The brief report Yoshi had radioed in 20 minutes earlier had been straight and to the point. Squad 1 had successfully disrupted the attempt by the local Britannian magnate to deploy his mercenary force to the Minami-Uenuma city center, but had not been able to successfully break contact with the Britannian opposition and escape via stolen car to the Shizuoka meetup point to the north. Instead, the 3 surviving members of the team had beaten a fighting retreat across the Kamakura-Saugo River and into the forested hills beyond, where they had dispersed into the trees. Fortunately, we had planned a secondary rendezvous point for just such an occasion, but it was impossible to tell if they would be able to escape from the Britannians and make their way individually on foot to the meeting point at Suwa Shrine. Personally, I fully expected to see all 3 surviving members of Squad 1 at the shrine sooner or later. It might take them the better part of the day to travel the approximately 4 miles over hilly, forested terrain, especially if the Britannians were still actively trying to pursue them through the undergrowth, but I was confident that Major Inoda's lessons in scouting and stealth would see them safely to the shrine. What no amount of lessons could do was bring back the 2 comrades I had lost today. Sumire, Monabu. I hadn't known either before I had hauled them and 58 others out to the school. After months of training and instruction, I still couldn't claim to know either one in a personal capacity, not like how I knew Nagata and Oki, but I had made it my business to know a little about everybody in the Kozuki organization. Sumire had enjoyed singing, and frequently led her squad in song during runs. She had enjoyed painting and other forms of arts, and had displayed a talent for sketching caricatures on the pages of her notes and assignments. On the rare occasions that I collected written work, I wished I had thought to keep some of her caricatures, instead of burning them with all of the other completed assignments in accordance with the no records policy. She left behind a husband and a 3-year-old son. She had been 28. Monabu had fancied himself an amateur wrestler, and had actually done a decent job backing up his claims of martial arts prowess during hand-to-hand training. Outside of training, he had been a fairly quiet guy, tending more towards being laid back instead of sullen. Apparently, he'd had a boyfriend he'd broken up with just before leaving for the school. He'd been 19. I had never deluded myself into thinking that I was invincible, or that the men and women who followed me into battle were immortal. No plan survives contact with reality, to say nothing of the enemy, and I had been incredibly lucky that none of my comrades had died up until now, in any of my lives. That knowledge, that things always go wrong and that I had lucked out spectacularly already, should have made it easier to accept their deaths, but, somehow, it didn't. It was a callous thought, but I found myself wishing that the first death under my command had happened back in my past life. I had deliberately kept my distance from the 203rd, doing my best to drive them away through harsh training to sabotage the rapid reaction force concept I had so foolishly proposed to General Zeta. While I had found myself almost reluctantly bonding with the men over subsequent missions, there had always been a degree of distance between myself and my command, with one notable exception. I had cared for them and been proud of them, but I hadn't truly been one of them, thanks to the expectations and pressures of rank. They had been treasured subordinates and excellent students, but with one exception I don't think I could have called them my friends. That cold shell of formality would have offered at least some small barrier, if I had lost my first subordinate in action during my second life. In this third life, I had no such barrier. I was one of the members of the Kozuki organization, an officer perhaps, but an officer in a band held together by the personal charisma of the leader and a shared goal. It was completely different from the institutional bonds of an industrial army, and it was impossible to remain aloof and still be an effective leader of guerrillas. I had eaten the same food from the same common pot, sweated through the same training exercises, slept on a bedroll identical to the ones issued to every trainee at the school. And during downtime, when I didn't have to be an instructor, I had spent hours drinking watery tea and chatting with my future comrades, getting to know them and letting them get to know me. They had to trust me to do what was right for them, if I wanted them to obey me in the field, and so I had answered every question they'd asked about my life in Shinjuku to the best of my ability. In the end, between my instruction, my efforts at bonding with them, and my shared participation in training events, I had won that trust and, I like to think, some measure of respect. And I had used the shared bond of that trust to bring Sumire, Monabu, and 8 other men and women to Niigata Prefecture. It's all just such a waste, I murmured aloud to the distant paddies, such a waste. Each of them had decades of life ahead of them, decades of productivity, of innovation, of growth, followed by a slow decline until retirement. And what had they bought with their sacrifice of all of those years? From some distant corner of my memories, it was impossible to tell if it came from my faded recollections of my first life or the razor-edged snapshots of my second. A scrap of poetry came unbidden to my mind. For by my glee might many men have laughed, and of my weeping something had been left, which must die now. The grass whispered back in the sussurrating wind as the next line came dribbling out. I mean the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. Now men will go content with what we spoiled. Or, discontent, boil bloody, and be spilled. Where had that come from? It must have been from some English class long ago and far away. For a moment, I had a memory of a classroom, warm and drowsy, golden motes of dust hanging in a sunbeam. I had memorized that poem to fulfill a requirement, and had read it aloud per my teacher's demand, but I hadn't truly read it back then, not in any way that provoked understanding. Now, lived experience gave me an undesired insight into that poem. I was no pacifist, I was unwilling to step back and simply let the world take from me and mine. I would fight until I had a life where I could be comfortable, both materially and within my own skin. Still, though, what price was too high to pay for that life? I had been content to conquer Dacia and Bernerin in my past life, acting in my capacity as a soldier of the Kaiser. Then, the responsibility for losses on either side, for the destruction of homes and businesses and places of worship and art and education, had been diffused among the thousands of people who had made such losses possible, from the politicians and generals at the top to the stubborn partisans who risen up and brought the hammer down on their city. It had been easy to shrug off any feeling of guilt. I may have penned the treatise that provided the justification for the army's actions, but the general staff had been the ones ordering its implementation. I was simply a gear in a vast machine, a soldier in an identical if specially tailored uniform, fighting for my salary and a cushy post in the rear. But now, in this third life, there was no rear echelon. Just being Japanese was enough to justify summary execution, and attempting to live a peaceful life was simply conceding to a slow death by starvation. The only path to a safe life I had seen required the installation of a new, more sympathetic government, one where my blood and name wouldn't automatically bar me from advancement. To that end, I had shed blood and made deals to build an army, whose strength I would use to justify my post-victory appointment to high office. While I truly wanted a better life for all of my people, for everybody in Shinjuku and Saitama and the other urban ghettos, for all the farmers trapped in de facto serfdom, for all the women and girls and boys taken and broken for the corrupt pleasures of evil men, I had joined this war to save my own skin. To look out for number one, to make sure I had all the chocolate and coffee I wanted and the safety to enjoy it in peace. It would be hard to keep that entirely understandable selfish desire in mind, though, when I visited Sumire's family. I had a duty to discharge, and that was part of it. Part of the deal of leadership, of trust exchanged and loyalty freely given. I would tell her son that his mother had died for a free Japan, and I would try not to choke on my lie. I would do my best to make sure that he was taken care of, at the very least, that he and his father and all other survivors of the Kozuki organization were taken care of as best as the Rising Sun's assets would allow. It still wouldn't be a fair trade for a mother, for a wife. For up to 6 decades of mornings, noons, and nights. I don't even know if Monabu had a family. I hope Ino has his next of kin on file. I sighed, and got to my feet. I would, mourn the dead later. I had to focus on saving the living now. One day, if I can, I will come back here, back to Niigata. Sumire, Monabu. I'll build a cairn somewhere for you. I hope you will appreciate it, if being X was unkind enough to deny you oblivion for some reason. Deliberately, I turned my back on the view of the Oono River Valley, and pulled my still-soaked sweatshirt and shoes back on. Mount up. I called to my comrades, drawing their attention to me. Everybody better be in that van in 3 minutes or less, or I'm eating all the dinner rations myself. April 8, 2016 ATB, Saru, Niigata. 0603. Suwa Shrine stood a world apart from the cities and towns of occupied Area 11, out on a meandering, crumbling road barely wide enough for a single vehicle. Although the cities that filled the valleys to the east and west of the mountain range had been carved up into the private fiefdoms of whichever Britannian lords Clovis had favored, this neglected shrine's grounds felt like a tiny fragment of old Japan. While the outside world had clearly forgotten Suwa Shrine, the fact that it still stood, when the majority of shrines and temples had been burnt as heathen nonsense during the first years of Britannian administration, attested to that. The locals equally clearly had not. The Kamina stone guard dogs were free of moss and twigs, and the inset brass plaques on their plinths were recently polished. A few wooden emma prayers clacked against each other and the tree from which they hung in the desultory breeze. The Torii Gate's saffron paint was weathered and chipped, and on the windward side much of the timber was visible, but someone had taken the time to apply sealant to cracks in the wood. Most telling was that part of the Honden's wood shingle roof had looked suspiciously new and shiny before the sun had set beyond the mountains, indicating someone had patched the sanctuary up after a damaging storm. It was heartening to see that some fragments of my people were making an active attempt to preserve this fragment of the culture we had once had. Even back in my first life, before I had the displeasure of meeting Being X, I had never been anything close to devout. I visited a local shrine at most twice a year, on New Year's and for the Spring Festival. My third life had been, if possible, even more estranged from the spiritual side of my native culture than my first. Being X's existence had increased the probability that something that could be called spiritual existed, and yet simultaneously demystified any such other world. After all, if spirits could be as petty and useless as Being X, why bother praying for good fortune at New Year's? It had surprised me how badly it had hurt to stand before the smoldering remains of Naruko Tenjin Shrine the day after the Britannians had finally gotten around to setting it ablaze, almost 3 years ago now. The old priest had somehow been tied to one of the rebel groups of the time, the Britannians had claimed, and in order to prevent the inspiration of future malcontents the shrine had been burnt. I hadn't been at the street battle where the old man had died, but I doubted an 80-year-old would have been involved in urban combat. In all likelihood, he had simply been caught in the crossfire. Either way, I had walked past the still smoking ashes of Naruko Tenjin on my way back from a job site the next day, and it had been disturbing in the extreme. Something about the shattered guard dogs, the broken remnants of the platform, the charred torii. It had been monstrously wrong. That moment had made some unidentifiable part of myself ache deep inside. Now, 3 years later, I shivered in a cramped delivery van tucked away behind another shrine, huddled up against Nagata and Tsubaki under a shared blanket. Spring might have officially come, but in the mountains of Niigata nights were still cold. Fortunately, we would not be here forever. Yoshi and his 2 squad mates had gotten back into radio contact 2 hours ago, when the handful of Britannian pursuers and their reluctant honorary Britannian helpers had retreated back to the city with sundown. After checking in and reassuring us that they had successfully broken contact, all 3 had indicated that they were heading to the shrine with all haste. That sounds perfect if you want to break your leg, running through the woods in the middle of the night. I had instructed them to take their time, to remember their training, and to take breaks as necessary. It had been an uncomfortable and sleepless night all around, despite everybody's best efforts. Every time someone needed to get out to take a leak, or to take their turn guarding, the rattling sliding door and the blast of cold night air had woken up anybody who had miraculously fallen asleep. The shared body heat could only do so much to heat up the van to begin with, and even my 12-year-old joints were stiff and sore as the first light of dawn broke over the mountains. At least I was out of the wind, unlike Squad 1. Squad 1 had spoiled any sleep that hadn't already been ruined by physical discomfort. Try as I might, I couldn't stop my thoughts from endlessly circling back to the losses of the day before, and the 3 men who were still out of my sight, potentially in danger. I had, of course, known that I couldn't do anything for them at this point, that I should be trying to rest as much as possible, just in case the Britannians somehow managed to find us way out in the mountains, but I had simply been unable to relax. As long as my comrades were out in the cold night somewhere, some illogical part of my mind had refused to come off of duty. And so I had stared up at the roof of the van, trying my best to remain as still and as quiet as possible. After all, my own inability to rest was no excuse to deprive my comrades of their dearly earned sleep. As the sun rose, my resolve to spend a second more in the van finally broke. I wriggled out from between my comrades, doing my best to move as gently and quietly as possible, and clambered up over the driver's seat and out the hopefully quieter driver's side door. My shoes, still somewhat damp from yesterday's wash, were immediately soaked once more by the dew pooling off the long grass. Quietly cursing as the accumulated moisture invaded my socks, I waved a polite good morning to the guard currently on duty. He bobbed his head back, his jaw working as he tried, and subsequently failed, to contain a yawn. I wished I could reassure him that there was coffee brewing, but I couldn't. Breakfast would be ration bars choked down by, admittedly, fresh spring water, collected the day before at a mountainside seep. I stepped away from the van and slowly walked my way around to the front of the shrine's grounds. The low stone stairs up to the torii gate were also wet with early morning dew dripping from the surrounding weeds, but I managed to navigate my way up to the gate without issue. Unfortunately, the shrine's grounds were still empty of any of my wandering comrades. For some reason, the shrine felt tranquil under the dawn, not deserted, not abandoned. I found myself walking down the flagstones of the sando, the pathway between the gate and the sanctuary hall. It was a short walk to the Hondan, and seemingly before I knew it I was in front of the old cedar structure. Out of long-forgotten habit, I looked around for a tamizuya to wash my hands and face at, but none were present at this backwoods shrine. I turned again, facing forward, and took a pace to the left, so I would not be standing in the taboo spot directly in front of the kami's entrance. I licked my lips, dry tongue leaving only a trace of moisture behind, and felt like a fool as I bowed deeply, from the waist, and then again. I wondered why I was doing any of this as I clapped twice, but found myself not praying, as praying was at best useless, but fervently hoping at the tiny sanctuary hall before me that my name was Hajime Tanya, and that I would be most thankful if my comrades arrived safe and sound, soon and without harm. Almost as soon as this hope crystallized in my mind, a treacherous train of thought butted in with the wish that the souls of Sumire and Monabu would find rest. I shook my head and straightened back up, forcing my eyes open. When had I closed them? I was just fooling around here, when I should be starting to get breakfast organized. I almost turned away from the shrine, but a deep-seated impulse nailed me to the ground until, with an irritated sigh, I excused myself from the shrine with another deep bow. Irritated with myself for my foolishness and exhausted from my sleepless night, I staggered back down the sando to the torii. Before I could set so much as a foot over the threshold separating the sacred world from the rest of mundanity, I froze. At the foot of the stone steps, streaked with mud, soaked with dew, stood Yoshi, unmistakable even with his bald head streaked with mud and sporting a long abrasion. Flanking him on either side were the two other surviving members of Squad 1, alive and unharmed. Feeling like I was in a dream, I staggered down the stone steps. It felt like I'd had some kind of break with reality as I stared at the three apparitions standing before me. Did I fall asleep at the shrine? Am I hallucinating? To my sleep-deprived and anxiety-ridden mind, there seemed to be only one way to find out. Moments later, I found myself with my arms wrapped around Yoshi's all-too-tangible belly, hugging him close. He was alive. They were alive. They were safe and alive. He staggered back a bit, swaying with fatigue and no doubt with surprise, and I suddenly realized what I had done. Damn it, Tanya. First you send two of them to their deaths, and then you can't even be a professional? Face burning with shame, I quickly let go of Yoshi and retreated 3 rapid steps back up the stairs, until I was roughly at a height where I could look the newly arrived trio in the eyes. Just seeing them here, after a night of worrying and internal recriminations, I couldn't help myself from smiling with relief. I might have lost a full fifth of my command, a horrible loss, by any measure, but the remainder were safe and unharmed. I would do better, I would find out what had gone wrong and learn from my mistake, but here and now. Welcome back, Squad 1, I greeted them, and saluted. You did all that I asked for and more. Yoshi still looked poleaxed, and I found myself hoping that he hadn't been concussed by whatever had given him that scrape on his forehead, but one of his comrades, a young man with a mohawk and a red headband, raised his rifle over his head and let out a hoarse cheer. The second man had a grin spreading across his face that abruptly made him look a decade younger, the tension almost visibly flowing out of him. I'll want a report, I began to say, and the mood abruptly dipped until I hurried to say later. In the meantime, there's ration bars for breakfast and all the spring water you can drink. Don't worry, we'll have a proper celebration once we get back to the school. The triumphant warriors let out another weary cheer and staggered off in the direction of the parked van, Yoshi following the two younger men in an apparent daze. For my part, I turned and looked back through the torii, back towards the Hondan. It might have been foolish to think along those lines, since I had known that Squad 1 was due back at any moment, but gratitude is never foolish. I bowed towards the Hondan in sincere thankfulness for the safe delivery of my comrades, in gratitude that none of them had gotten lost or injured during their long nighttime trek. Thank you. Thank you. Japan will live again. I swear it. April 9, 2016 ATB, the school training facility, 0928. The Kanayamazawa River, swollen with snowmelt, lapped at the base of my training boulder, beneath my dangling feet. Spring had well and truly come to Gunma Prefecture, and even the Japanese Alps of inland Honshu couldn't resist the growing warmth forever. Ogi stood next to the boulder, trying without success to skip stones across the fast-moving stream. Even if the water's surface had been as still and flat as a mediation pond, I doubted he would have been particularly successful, considering the lack of any real finesse on display. I considered correcting his throwing motion, perhaps trying to demonstrate the correct way to flick the wrist and send a river-smoothed stone across the water, but decided against it. The quiet of the moment, broken only by the burbling of the shallow river over its rocky bed, was too precious to be squandered on a pointless lesson. Besides, Ogi looked like he was enjoying tossing stones into the river. Who was I to disturb his fun? It's not like we were on the clock, at least not for another few hours. My team had finally returned to the school late yesterday afternoon, after taking a long and circuitous route out of Niigata Prefecture. By the time we had finally returned to our secret outpost in the backwoods of Nakanojo, the sun had already set behind the mountains and the shadows had lengthened under the cedars. Despite our late arrival, Ogi, master of fostering intra-organizational cooperation, had a congratulatory feast waiting. He dipped into organizational funds to provide an extra nice meal, with pork cutlets and fresh rice instead of the usual boiled cabbage and porridge. He'd even gone far enough to buy a dozen bottles of cheap but potent liquor, presumably distilled in some backwoods shack by a furtive local. Frankly, I had just been relieved that the party Ogi had set up would delay any serious conversation until the next day. Seizing the opportunity with both hands, I had proclaimed that the next day's morning training would be cancelled, and all of the recruits of both classes could do as they wished with their free time, to general acclaim. As expected, come the morning, most of the recruits, and Nagata, were still in their barracks, nursing ferocious hangovers. Notable in his absence was Major Onoda. Almost as soon as I had returned, he had vanished, delaying his departure only long enough to get a quick report on the operation. I could only assume that he had returned to the nearest JLF installation to convey the news of our successful mission to the mysterious leader of his faction, Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe. I wished Onoda all the best at milking the opportunity for every bit of glory that he could manage. The better he was rewarded, the more generous he would hopefully be when the next round of negotiations began. It was Ogi who brought the mid-morning peace to an end. He had woken up around the same time that I had, and had followed me to my private practice spot. I'd made it clear that I'd not been in much of a mood to talk, and he'd obligingly remained silent for the last 20 minutes. Throwing the last of his collected semi-smooth stones into the river with a desultory plop, Ogi brushed his hands off against his jeans and turned towards me. I kept my gaze fixed on the water splashing against a small cluster of rocks in the middle of the stream, and wondered how long it would take for one of the cluster to be pulled away from the rest and pulled under. I wanted to congratulate you personally, Tanya, Ogi began, his tone calm and seemingly earnest. I've spoken with both Yoshi and Tsubuki, and they were both very impressed with your overall leadership. I could hear the unspoken but, just as clearly as I could hear the raven croaking in the trees somewhere across the river. I knew that Ogi was too soft a touch, and for that matter too Japanese, to bring up my failings directly without dancing around them enough to soften the blow. Instead of letting him proceed, I decided to adopt a technique I hoped he would respect as a teacher. I learned two things from the mission, Ogi, I began, turning away from the river and its endless war on the resisting stones and towards my comrade. The first is that allowing the enemy any chance to fight back is foolish, the second is that we need better equipment to be effective. Ogi raised an inquisitive eyebrow. I'm pretty sure you already knew that first lesson, Tanya. You didn't exactly give the Kokirikai much of a warning. He smiled faintly at that, and I smiled back. The station, For all it had been a small slice of an all too familiar hell, had been brilliantly executed, and I felt justly proud of it. I should feel proud. I didn't lose anybody on that mission. The smile went away. You're right, I sighed, trying to figure out how to pin down what I was trying to say, but it seems like I required a refresher. Ogi didn't respond, but the polite silence somehow pried the words out of me. I rushed this mission, Ogi. While the basic objective was successfully completed, if I had taken an extra day or two to plan and improve on the groundwork, I could have greatly improved the mission's outcome. I took a deep, cleansing breath, and let the emotion flow out with the exhale before continuing, sinking into the cadence familiar from so many post-mission debriefings before. Squad 2, after deploying from the van, rapidly advanced through downtown Minami-Uenuma to the city hall. Once there, they proceeded to their primary target, the mayor's office, only to find him absent. While they were able to liquidate his deputy and his secretary, missing the mayor was an unfortunate failure. They proceeded to the secondary target of the municipal archives, destroyed all the computers they could find and piled up and burnt all blueprints and records they could in the 3-minute window available. Then, they exited Town Hall and encountered between 20 and 30 honorary Britannian police dispatched from the Minami-Uenuma Central Police Station. While Squad 2 was easily able to suppress the police with small arms fire, they were bogged down and were compelled to retreat back to the van for extraction. It sounds like they were very successful, Ogi replied mildly, holding up a hand and ticking points off on his extended fingers. They occupied the available police in the city center, keeping them away from the radio station, which was the primary goal. They managed to disrupt the municipal government, which was a secondary goal at best. They managed to retreat in good order without so much as a bruise. True, I acknowledged, but it could have gone better, as could Squad 1 side of the operation. I closed my eyes for a moment and took another deep breath. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, hold, exhale. Squad 1 successfully detonated the bombs at Shizawa Station and at the ambush site on Prefectural Route 124. Unfortunately, the pipe bomb was insufficient to destroy the first APC, although it was able to sufficiently damage the wheels that the vehicle was immobilized, blocking the second APC as well. Similarly, the RPGs Squad 1 had on hand proved insufficient to penetrate the vehicle's armor, and the mercenaries were able to exit the vehicles, which they took cover behind. While Squad 1 was able to complete their objective by preventing the deployment of the mercenary unit to the city center, they were unable to smoothly withdraw, due to a flanking pincer attack by the mercenaries who took advantage of nearby farm buildings for cover, rapidly forcing Squad 1 back. During this time Squad 1 took 40% casualties and were forced to retreat to the woods on foot, where they took evasive action. I was proud that my voice had remained cool and collected all the way through, barring a slight hitch at the word casualties. Ogi had maintained eye contact as I had completed my summation, nodding at each point. I did my best to ignore the pained look at the closing sentence. Ogi had probably done a better job getting to know Sumire and Monabu. He was always talking with the recruits, always taking the time to chat whenever he wasn't conducting a lesson. So, I continued, keeping my war college demeanor as I approached the next section of the debriefing process. In regards to lessons learned, we can observe two main points. First, better preparations would likely have improved mission outcomes. Second, better equipment is necessary for future engagements with Britannian armored troops. Ogi frowned slightly, but nodded. Both of those are valid lessons to take from this mission, Tanya. But, aren't you forgetting the old adage that perfect is the enemy of good enough? You managed to complete your mission successfully, isn't that good enough? No. With a burst of motion, the ravens across the river startled into flight, irate caws resounding as they took wing. I could feel the heat spreading across my cheeks, but pushed on, forcing myself to continue at a more reasonable volume. No, Ogi, it wasn't good enough. This was only barely a success, a C grade at best, and only a single step on a long, long road. I lost 20% of my fighting strength against a pack of washouts with surplus gear. If that had been a real Royal Britannian Army formation, Squad 1 would all be dead. All of them, not just the two that I did lose because I didn't plan well enough. I realized I was shouting again. The fact that Ogi just took it without even looking angry just made it worse. Damn you, puberty, for making me sound like a stupid, unprofessional child. With a last shudder of anger at myself, At my inability to be good enough, I finally managed to get my treacherous mouth back under control, and after a moment of struggle managed to regain a semblance of calm. That said, the focus on mobility is clearly a winning strategy. Hit-and-run attacks are likely to be the meat of our operations going forwards. Still, there is plenty of room for improvement. Better intelligence would act as a force multiplier, as would sabotage. If I could have disabled the APCs before the mercenaries even attempted to deploy, or found some way to render the mercenaries unable or unwilling to fight, that would have achieved the objective at a far lower price. Ogi nodded at that. You have a point there, Tanya. If possible, we should look into ways of sabotaging the enemy before they can even fight. We also need to improve our kit for when the time comes to fight. As much as I loved the idea of preventing the enemy from deploying at all, I knew it to be a hopeless fantasy at best, a potentially dangerous distraction at worst. In the future, it's almost guaranteed that we will have to handle Britannia's nightmares, and our current gear couldn't even deal with retired APCs. We need dedicated anti-armor and anti-vehicle weapons if we want any chance of victory against Britannia in the long term. Ogi winced at that, and nodded with fervent enthusiasm. Yoshi said something similar when I spoke with him last night. He noticed my questioning expression, and hastily explained, he wasn't pleased with how ineffective the RPGs were. He'd hoped they'd be enough to take out at least one of the vehicles, but... Ogi shrugged helplessly, and I nodded my understanding. I bet Yoshi was a hell of a lot more than wasn't pleased at the time. And... Ogi looked away for a moment, took a deep breath, and re-established eye contact, and... How are you feeling, Tanya? Really, how are you feeling? I told you I spoke with Yoshi and Tsubaki last night, and they were very impressed with your leadership, but Yoshi said that he'd been very surprised at how enthusiastically you greeted him at the shrine, and Tsubaki told me how quiet you were all the way back from Minamio and Uma. Ogi took another deep breath, and slowly reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. And... This is the first time you've lost someone under your command, right, Tanya? How are you feeling? I bit down on my tongue, fighting back the immediate impulse to take the easy way out by claiming I'm fine. Even if it was true, instantly replying to such a loaded question would have clearly shown a lack of consideration, which would indicate either that I was being deliberately rude, or that I was unwilling to think about the question, and thus was not, in fact, fine. Instead, I took a moment to think, and to try to get my thoughts in order. Ogi quietly waited, seemingly as patient as the river flowing past us. I am upset, I haltingly began, trying to disentangle the knot of painful emotions with the cool scalpel of logical analysis, because I lost 2 trained fighters immediately after they had completed their training. This loss represents a waste of the time, energy, and expense involved in training them, an investment with very little return. I swallowed hard, pushing down the lump in my throat. While the loss of 2 good students and promising comrades was a regrettable waste of resources, the thought lacked any emotional resonance. But, what can I say? I'm sorry that Sumire will never know her son. I wish Monabu had made up with his partner before he left. This is war. People die. If I can't handle it. I didn't think Ogi would reject me, or try to force me out or anything. That was absurd. But I could see him trying, with the best of intentions, to move me over more towards the benevolent association side of the organization, away from combat operations. While I would typically be overjoyed with an easy assignment to the rear like that, and much as I would like to never fight again, to never risk my life, it was too early for any such reassignment. I knew where I could best help the Kozuki organization, and at the moment it was as a strategic planner and tactical asset. But from what I knew of Ogi and his relentless pursuit of what he felt was right, I doubted that he would see things the same way, especially if he felt like I couldn't handle the pressure. I wish that it hadn't turned out this way, I continued. That much is true, at least. I know and understand that loss is part of combat leadership, but I feel like the objective Sumire and Monabu died to accomplish was not worth the cost we paid. Looking back on it, just disabling the APCs would have been more than enough to hinder the deployment of the Britannian Goon Squad. I should have told Squad 1 to fall back at that point, instead of trading fire to keep the mercenaries pinned. I feel like I could have done a better job planning out the operation and found a way to achieve the same goals without the loss. I am angry at myself for this failure. Again, entirely true, and that should be enough probable cause to get Ogi to drop it. In regards to my unprofessional conduct yesterday morning, I moved on, taking the bull by the horns and confronting my failings when it came to Yoshi's dawn arrival. I figured this might actually be a point that Ogi, as the nearest thing the Kozuki organization had to an HR manager, was concerned about, and so I did my best to express contrition. I regret intruding on Yoshi's personal space, there was no excuse for it, and I will apologize to him when next I see him. Ogi had unaccountably begun to frown as I apologized. Wincing internally, I tried to explain the circumstances without sounding like I was trying to excuse my bad behavior. I was feeling very worn out and tired, due to the stress of the operation the day before and the sleepless night. I had woken up worried about the 3 members of Squad 1. When I saw that they had arrived safely and intact, I forgot my manners. It will not happen again. The stress and worry was also why I declined to interact with anybody on the way back. I was concerned that my anxiety would lead me to further incivility. Ogi sighed and looked away, rubbing at his forehead with the base of his palm. Well, Tanya, I'm sure everything you've said was completely true. With a groan, he turned back to me with a complicated expression that I only saw for a moment, before it melted away as he made eye contact once again. I couldn't mistake that sympathetic look for anything else. I'm happy to see that you're dealing with the loss so well. I'm proud of you. What? Why? I squandered 2 lives on a proxy mission given by a bastard so untrustworthy that he's actively conspiring against his boss's boss. Why would you be proud of me? I fucked up. Somehow, Ogi seemed to have noticed my disbelief. I'm very proud of you, Tanya, he repeated firmly. You did an excellent job, and I know that Sumire and Monabu would agree. They trusted you, Tanya, just like Nagata does and the rest of your friends do. I don't think they would say you squandered them. They knew the risks when they signed up, just like all the rest of us. I tried to take consolation from that, but I couldn't. Who can speak for the dead? The living have a vested interest in putting words in their mouths. I'll never know if Sumire or Monabu would have agreed to die in rice paddies on the fringe of an unimportant city, and neither does Ogi. For what it's worth, Ogi continued, a light smile breaking the tension of the moment slightly. I don't think Yoshi's at all bothered about your surprise hug. Personally, I think he was just shocked, and maybe a touch embarrassed. You don't need to apologize to him about it. I forced an answering smile, to let Ogi I gotten the message. I didn't know why Ogi thought the breach of protocol wasn't worth worrying about, considering how touch-sensitive Japanese culture was, but if the officer in charge of intra-organizational matters said I didn't need to feel guilty about the matter, I would take his word for it. One less thing to worry about, I suppose. Ogi apparently decided to end on a high note with that piece of good news, insignificant though it was. He turned and started picking his way over the shingles of the beach towards the tree line and the path back to the school. I watched him go for a moment, just to make sure that he wouldn't trip over any of the stones, before turning back out to the river. I still had another 2 hours of free time before I had to attend a meeting with the 18 trainee squad leaders to work out the next week's chore assignments, and I saw no need to return to the school so much as a minute early. Behind me, the sounds of rocks crunching underfoot stopped far too early for Ogi to have made more than a few meters away. Tanya? I half turned, just far enough to see Ogi out of my peripheral vision. I'm very proud of you, but I know you'll do better next time around. Nobody's perfect, and we're all constantly learning and improving. I have complete confidence that you'll improve too. I turned to face Ogi entirely, and hopped down off the boulder. Half a year ago, I'd have thought that was a veiled threat. I would have heard an unstated or else at the end of that last sentence. In retrospect, I really was being very unfair to Ogi. I found that I didn't need to force a smile as I picked my way over the river-smoothed stones to my friend. I can't say I approve of his blithe certainty, but I'll do my best to prove his foolish optimism correct. Thank you for your confidence, Ogi. I clapped him on the shoulder as I walked past, somewhat surprised to realize that it wasn't as much of a reach as it had once been. Let's go check in on our trainees and see if anybody's brave enough to volunteer for an optional fun run to get the blood flowing. April 16, 2016 ATB, the school training facility. Almost a week after his sudden departure, Major Inoda reappeared with equal abruptness. He swaggered out of the woods just before lunchtime, his uniform neatly pressed and his puttees spotless. I could only assume that whatever hidden entrance to the JLF's subterranean tunnel network he had emerged from was remarkably close to school grounds, for him to have escaped the omnipresent springtime mud. Anoda's attitude of smug self-satisfaction remained entirely intact when I joined him in the former principal's office for our scheduled meeting. I very swiftly learned the reason for Anoda's barely contained joy. Almost before the door had closed behind me, the JLF officer's typical formality cracked. "Ah, Miss Hajime, such a pleasure to see you again." Before I could respond to Anoda's surprisingly pleasant greeting, he had already moved on. Clearly, etiquette was not high on his list of concerns for the evening. "I'm sure you'll be happy to hear that the first wave of recruits from Niigata and Toyama prefectures have already found their way to the front." Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe swore in the largest single batch of recruits we've had in 4 years last night. I tilted my head respectfully as I lowered myself down onto the waiting pillow. "That must be a very nice feather in his cap. Please pass my congratulations on to the colonel." Judging by how Anoda had phrased the news, it sounded like Kusakabe had managed to induct the lion's share of the first wave directly into his faction. General Kotase must be really losing his grip if Kusakabe's getting this bold. He will be pleased to hear it, I am sure. Anoda smirked for a moment, before thankfully answering a question I had been somewhat afraid to ask. "In light of the recent swelling in our ranks, General Kotase has opted to extend official recognition to your operation in Niigata. Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe has, of course, been awarded a formal commendation for the operation and subsequent recruitment boost." I smiled politely as I winced internally at Kotase's unforced blunder. True, the leader of the JLF had been put on the horns of a thorny dilemma: either punish the officer whose boldness had led to the influx of fresh blood, or reward that officer for his rank insubordination. But my sympathy was limited. Kotase had given Kusakabe far too much freedom and hadn't bothered to keep an eye on his clearly ambitious subordinate. And now he's been forced to publicly applaud Kusakabe's actions just to try and save face, all but guaranteeing Kusakabe is going to do the same thing again. It's the Kwantung Army all over again. For my sake, I could only hope my alliance of convenience with the JLF had run its course before they decided to invade China in the name of a defensible frontier. "Truly, you outdid yourself, Miss Hajime," Anoda continued, mustache wriggling across his unusually expressive face, emotionless facade abandoned in light of this moment of triumph I had handed to his faction. "I will admit, I had my doubts if you and your militia would be able to successfully complete your mission, but you exceeded my wildest hopes." A vicious smile crossed the Major's face as he leaned in over the low table between us. "Niigata Prefecture is spiraling out of Britannian control, thanks to your handling of affairs in Minami-Uenuma City. The farmers and townsfolk of the prefecture have realized how weak the local minions of Prince Clovis truly are, and have begun to take matters into their own hands. Every night for the past week, at least one house belonging to the family of an honorary Britannian policeman has gone up in flames, sometimes with the family still inside. Lone collaborators are disappearing and being found dangling from trees or crammed into trash cans. Finally." Anoda leaned back on his haunches, a smile that edged on the precipice of glee on his face. "Finally, the true sons of Japan are rising up against the running dog scum of Britannia. I assume that the reprisals have begun?" I was more or less certain I already knew the answer, but I was curious what Anoda's opinion was about the likely hundreds of true sons of Japan that were paying for these impromptu attacks. "I find it hard to believe that the Britannian army garrison in Niigata City has just been sitting back and watching as the trees sprout fruit overnight." Anoda laughed at that. "Oh yes, they certainly have tried to smash the defiance back out of Niigata's people in the usual way. The crematories have been kept tragically busy, and at least one village has been entirely emptied." He leaned back in towards me with an almost conspiratorial air. "But the locals have gotten better and better at escaping into the woods when a Britannian column approaches. Many of the younger local men have even ended up finding their way to JLF outposts, ready and willing to join up to avenge these fresh Britannian atrocities. And the hangings continue. The Britannians are flailing about, but they lose more lackeys every day, and the number of recruits who remember Japan and sign up with us just keeps growing." It was difficult to keep the polite smile on my face as I nodded appreciatively along with Anoda's words. It was a dirty truth of guerrilla war that one of the greatest beneficiaries of atrocities committed by occupying powers were the local insurgents. The hatred generated by poorly disciplined soldiers or short-sighted officers lashing out was the fuel that the engines of rebellion thirstily drank. I was a beneficiary of this same truth, as most of my recruits had signed up in the aftermath of the Christmas incident. That said, I'd never been gleeful about it. I'd never laughed about it. I lived it, Major Onoda. I could have been one of the 100 civilians put up against a wall to pay the debt for a single Britannian's blood. But you've spent the years since the conquest in a bunker, safe from that fate. Haven't you, Major? My congratulations to Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe, Major Onoda, I choked out with difficulty. I imagine this sort of popular resistance does a great deal to strengthen his position when it comes to arguing in favor of a more aggressive policy. Onoda beamed, utterly failing to conceal his naked delight at the horrors Kusakabe would undoubtedly try to unleash from his new position of strength. Indeed, General Kotase soon will be compelled to admit that the day of liberation is nearly at hand. Even Todo of Miracles cannot dispute that the momentum is starting to turn in our favor at long last. My group and I would love to assist Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe with bringing the day of liberation upon us all the sooner, I replied, taking the opportunity to pivot away from gloating about past success into laying the groundwork for future operations. But the most recent mission, successful though it was, revealed a significant flaw in the current doctrine and equipment of my organization. Onoda raised an eyebrow, joy receding slightly now that matters of business were at hand. Oh? It seems to my superiors and I that your little band did a more than adequate job with your current equipment. What's this flaw you claim to have uncovered? We lack specially equipped anti-armor units, Major, I replied, smoothly ignoring the implied insult in his response. Amazing how short-lived gratitude can be, from outdoing ourselves to more than adequate in minutes. While we were able to complete the JLF's objective with the Niigata mission, the anti-personnel and light anti-vehicle munitions we used were only marginally effective against outdated armored vehicles. As the Britannian Army heavily fields nightmare frames, as well as other armored units, an effective anti-armor weapon will be necessary to deal damage to regular Britannian units. Onoda hummed his agreement, before tapping on the table. That is a good point, Miss Hajime, and your organization's primary value to the JLF is as a deniable unit for use against the Britannians. Training and equipping your organization to the point where you're actually dangerous to the foreign invaders would be useful towards that end. I nodded my careful agreement. Onoda was, unfortunately, accurate. The Kozuki organization was best used as an enabler of his faction's ongoing campaign of Gekkoku, which also implied that we were both deniable and disposable. Since we both already agreed on that point, that statement of fact clearly wasn't the other shoe dropping. Wait for it. On the other hand, Onoda continued, you still owe me another mission for the past 3 months' worth of logistical support. If you want access to the JLF's stockpile of anti-armor weaponry, not to mention ongoing logistical support for your fresh cohort of recruits. There it is. Of course, Major Onoda, I had been waiting and preparing for this resumption of negotiations for months, and it was almost a relief that it had finally come. While the JLF still held most of the cards for this round, I wasn't coming to the table quite as empty-handed as I had the first time around. During the first round of negotiations, I had been representing an organization that was coming to the JLF as a new hire, one that had a recommendation from a senior partner, but a new hire nonetheless. I had little to offer at that point, and Major Onoda had been blatant in his disrespect and distaste for my organization in general and myself in particular. Now, I was representing an established contractor of sorts, one that had proven it could complete complex and high-stress projects and could use resources efficiently. Besides that, I was a known quantity to the Major. He still might not particularly like me, but at least he wasn't dismissing me out of hand on the basis of my hair color and gender. During the time that you have spent assisting with the instruction of my recruits, you have consistently expressed your interest in blooding the trainees as part of their instruction. Indeed, it had been the one point that Onoda Hiro had brought up over and over again, insisting that the lack of killing only produced half-baked soldiers. If nothing else, that sort of singular focus indicated a potential lever. I am still dubious about the efficacy of blooding tomorrow's soldiers by killing bound civilian targets, as stabbing bound men and women has little in common with defeating armed opponents, but I agree that some seasoning would improve the training program. As such, In exchange for ongoing logistical support for the school, as liaison for the JLF, you would have the right to give each graduating cohort of trainees a mission with objectives set as you see fit, contingent on approval from myself or another officer. Much as I hated to admit it, for all of his faults Onoda was a highly capable soldier, an expert scout, a skilled intelligence operator, and a surprisingly effective trainer. Giving him what he wanted would probably end up as a net benefit for both my organization and the JLF. I just hate giving him the win. But such is the negotiation process. Besides, there was no way I would give him carte blanche to send my comrades into danger, at least not without sign-off from Naoto, Ogi, or myself. I had not spent months of my time training up a new cohort of soldiers just to watch them be squandered in the name of appeasing Onoda's bloodlust. Onoda sucked non-committally through his teeth, but I could tell by the glint in his eye that he was interested. And now that I've given him what he wanted, let's see if he'll meet me halfway. And I suppose if I am blooding your trainees by sending them after objectives important to the JLF, it would be in our benefit to train and equip them with anti-armor weapons, Onoda mused aloud, nodding his head. Yes, I suppose I could sell that point to my superiors. You do understand that this doesn't get you out of your obligation to personally complete a second mission, yes? I tilted my head at an appropriately deferential angle, and carefully made sure no hint of the internal sense of triumph touched my face. Of course, Major. And I am ready to deploy on that mission at your convenience. Excellent. The smirk had returned to Onoda's face. I happen to have a job at hand that I think would be perfect for you, and would give your recruits a chance to familiarize themselves with those anti-armor weapons you seem so taken by. It was fortunate that my head was still tilted forward, since I don't think I could have concealed the spasm of anger that flashed across my face. Damn it. I knew that was way too easy. The bastard walked me into this. He'd been planning on giving me anti-tank weapons the whole time. Yet another reminder that it was a mistake to think of Onoda as a mere bloodthirsty monster. He unquestionably was a murderous piece of work, but he was also lethally intelligent. I had no idea he was playing me. He must be incredible at poker. I'm glad to hear that, I replied, hastily reassembling my polite smile and looking up to re-establish eye contact. What's the objective this time? Onoda's smirk once again faded in favor of a more serious expression. He's a professional, even if he is a petty bastard. The JLF has intercepted intelligence that, in response to the ongoing violence in Niigata, the prefect of Nagano plans on establishing a number of bases along entry points into Nagano from Niigata to prevent any spillover into his territory. Apparently he's concerned about bands of rebels and bandits hanging his policemen and interfering with planting season. I nodded. That seemed like a sensible enough approach, improving fortifications at choke points along the border and supplementing patrols of the interior would make it more difficult to operate openly. Whichever lord had been appointed as the prefect of Nagano was clearly either competent or willing to listen to competent advisors. One of the smaller new garrisons will be located in the village of Sakai, Onoda continued, at the border of Nagano and Niigata prefectures. It also happens to sit on the main train line through the Haida Mountains, as well as on the intersection of Route 117 and prefectural routes 238 and 507. It's got a population of around 2,000 Japanese, so the prefect is sending a company of nightmares, 5 squads of 4, and a battalion of infantry, plus attached support units. It sounds like the prefect chose his new base's location quite well, I replied. From what I dimly remembered of Nagano's geography, Sakai was in the extreme northeast of the prefecture, but based on Onoda's description it was a natural choke point. The valley it sat in was the only efficient way through the so-called Japanese Alps, and the intersection of multiple prefectural routes would give the garrison the ability to lock down most traffic in the area with ease. Onoda nodded. He did indeed. That said, the base isn't fully established yet. The infantry have already set up in the location, but the Nightmare Company hasn't been dispatched yet. We have received word that the first squad of that company will be escorting 2 trucks full of maintenance tools and spare parts for Nightmare frames from Nagano City to Sakai in 2 days. Stealing those supplies would be of great value to the JLF, and would give us time to move units through the choke point from Niigata and Gunma into Nagano, before the Nightmares arrive and complicate the situation. I nodded vaguely, turning the situation over in my mind. This was definitely a priority mission, since removing a Dugan military installation in a mountain valley without aerial support would be tricky at best, and almost impossible if a company of highly agile nightmares were on scene to support the infantry units. That said, I hadn't seen a nightmare in person since the second year after the conquest, when the Britannians had finished crushing the last resurgence of organized resistance in Shinjuku. They were figures that stalked my memories of the conquest and the brutal times that had followed after, though, and I remembered endless stories of how effortlessly Britannian nightmares had destroyed the Japanese army. I wasn't eager to tangle with the mechanical monsters of Britannia myself. But if not now, when? It's got to come sometime. And I can't exactly turn this mission down without burning my value in Onoda's eyes. Do you need the nightmares or the trucks, or only the cargo? I asked, trying to focus on the concrete details of the task at hand. And do you know the intended route and timetable? As it turned out, Onoda's source had given him all the information I would need. A few minutes later, we agreed to meet again tomorrow afternoon after the last training session of the day so I could present my intended strategy. For better or worse, I was committed to my first mission with nightmares attached to the opposition. April 18, 2016 ATB, Sakai, Nagano. 0527. Corporal Martin Lancaster, of the 4th Support Regiment, was not having a good day. As he stepped down from the cab of the truck, he was filled with the horrible certainty that it was about to get significantly worse. Lancaster had found out late the night before that he had drawn the miserable duty of accompanying a delivery of spare parts out into the mountainous hinterlands, courtesy of the chief of the Nightmare Maintenance Section. When Lancaster had asked why the logistics boys had needed his company for a routine delivery, he'd been informed that the powers that be had decided that the Sakai outpost would have a nightmare repair bay attached, and that part of the standard paperwork for such a facility was the sign-off of a rated technician. Since Martin had been out on leave yesterday when that decision had been handed down from on high, he hadn't been in the room at the time, and some bastard had volunteered him for the duty. A duty, he'd been irritated to learn, scheduled to begin at 4 the next morning when the delivery convoy was scheduled to leave Nagano barracks with an escort of nightmares. Needless to say, come the next morning, Corporal Lancaster hadn't been looking or feeling his best when he had reported into the lieutenant commanding the escorting nightmare squad. Despite the purpose of the convoy being an almost purely logistical matter, Lieutenant McPherson had wound up in command of the operation by dint of claiming that, as the trucks were transporting spare parts and maintenance tools for nightmare frames, the convoy should be under the authority of the local expert on nightmares. Personally, Martin suspected that the officer, as both a noble and a nightmare pilot and so doubly arrogant, would rather lick his frame clean than take orders from a common-born logistics corps oik. Neither of the truck drivers had felt the need to argue with the man, and so the little convoy had set out on the hour-and-a-half drive to Sakai village. The drive had been quiet, and the roads nearly empty so early in the morning. Martin had been halfway to napping in the passenger seat of the lead truck when the radio had suddenly crackled to life only 10 minutes out from their destination. Lance lead to all units. Halt immediately. Suspected explosive device identified. Over. Martin's drowsiness had vanished as the icy claws of shock sank into his shoulders and back. He'd fumbled for the radio, checking the channel and flipping the switch to transmit as the driver immediately began to slow to a halt. "See, copy that, Lance lead," he had stuttered into the microphone. "Location of the device? Over. Look on the right side of the road by the tunnel and it should be obvious. Over." Internally cursing the noble prick, Martin did as he was bid, and had immediately understood the lieutenant's concern. 100 yards ahead of the leading pair of nightmares, a tunnel gaped, the darkness of the interior barely dented by the dim line of light fixtures, half of which were burnt out and in need of repair. Just barely outside the tunnel's entrance, an oil drum lay on its side, blue paint chipped away to reveal rusting sides. A few pieces of garbage were scattered around the drum, and maybe the wire protruding from one side of it was just another piece of such garbage. Or perhaps not. Martin had licked his suddenly dry lips. It's probably just garbage, he had reminded himself, nothing to worry about. But if it wasn't? He'd shaken his head, trying to force the thought from his mind. There were other ways to get to Sakai, less efficient, admittedly, but still there. That said, showing up late because of some roadside garbage wouldn't look good either. As if to respond to his thought, the radio had crackled back to life, and said exactly what Martin had been afraid it would. Lance, lead to truck 1. Send the passenger out on foot to visually inspect the drum. Go see if that wire connects to anything. Over. The driver had glanced sidelong over at Martin, who suddenly felt completely unable to move. The logistics man reached over, flicked the transmit switch, and replied, "Roger that, Lance, lead, he's on his way." Flicking the switch off, the driver had shrugged apologetically at Martin. "Guess you drew the short straw, eh? Come on, get out before that prick starts pissing over us all." And now, Martin found himself slowly walking up the road, doing his best to conceal the nerve-wracking tension. The escorting nightmares, and the arsehole lieutenant commanding them, were already yards behind him. Ahead, the dark mouth of the tunnel loomed, the drum protruding like a broken tooth. Why the hell is the tunnel so dark? Martin wondered, deliberately not thinking about how many pounds of high explosive and nails could conceivably be crammed into an oil drum. This is a priority road. DPW should have changed out those bulbs months ago. In all likelihood, if funds had ever been allocated for maintenance of the Route 117 tunnel, Martin was all but certain they'd been immediately embezzled. The Directorate of Public Works was infamously corrupt, which explained why the only infrastructure projects making any progress in the area were the ones the governor had taken a personal interest in, like the maglev extensions. And, of course, the roads and rails feeding the saccharide mining complexes. Suddenly, Martin found himself only 10 feet or so from the drum. He looked back over his shoulder, and could almost feel the lieutenant glaring at him through the Sutherland's fact sphere, demanding him to hurry up and get on with it. Swallowing, he turned back to the drum, horribly aware that his body armor was only rated for small caliber rounds and shrapnel, not explosive devices meant to take out vehicles. "Why the hell am I having to do this?" Martin raged as he tried to muster up the will to take another step forward, and then another. "There's gotta be some 11s around here, farmers, or loggers, or whatever. Why the hell didn't the lieutenant just give us the permission to grab one of them to play human minesweeper, huh? I'm a goddamn certified nightmare tech, a rated maintenance professional. This kinda shit is number work." The drum was at Martin's feet, and his heart was in his mouth. Praying to a god who suddenly felt all too close, Martin slowly, carefully, knelt down before the drum, and leaned to the side. The damp air wafting out of the tunnel felt clammy and cold, even colder than the mountain air, and Martin shivered uncontrollably as cold wet fingers ran across the nape of his exposed neck. He couldn't see anything in the dark interior of the barrel, just that wire, snaking away. Martin suddenly remembered the small flashlight built into the side of his visor, and felt like an idiot. Flicking it on, Corporal Lancaster abruptly felt all the tension and dread flow out of him. The drum was full of smashed-up concrete and bent rebar, clearly the results of some sort of demolition. With an experimental jerk, the wire came loose in his hands, revealing itself to just be a simple piece of overlooked scrap protruding from the garbage. Flicking the light off, Martin got back to his knees, dusting his gloved hands off before activating the radio built into his helmet. "Corporal Lancaster to Lance, lead, the barrel's full of busted concrete. Someone's demolishing something, and a barrel probably fell off the truck they were using to haul away the debris. Over." A moment later, the lieutenant responded. "Lance, lead here. If that's the case, quit standing around like a fool and get back in the truck. This nonsense has put us behind schedule, and I hate being late. Over." Martin acknowledged the junior officer and made your pain in the ass's order and began walking back to the truck. Now that the stress of potential death via explosion had receded, it was quite a nice morning for a walk. The air was pleasantly crisp, the sound of the wind in the cedars a pleasant accompaniment to the early morning birdsong, and the perfume of the spring flowers hung heavily. Maybe today will be a good day after all. April 18, 2016 ATB, Sakai, Nagano. 0530. Senior Lieutenant Kenneth McPherson drummed his fingers impatiently as the DOF Lancaster slowly made his way back to the truck, before taking his sweet time to climb back into the cab. Almost as soon as the door closed behind the insolent pissant, Kenneth's index finger was jabbing at the transmit button on his Nightmare's instrument panel. "Lance, lead to convoy, advance in formation, over." Beneath him, the Yggdrasil drive whirred to life, and Kenneth could practically see the core luminous spinning with increasing speed in his mind's eye as his majestic Sutherland cruised into the tunnel. From the corner of his eye, Kenneth noticed the engravings of flowers, mountains, and the old crest of Nagano Prefecture, and grimaced with disgust. an old 11 tunnel, built before the conquest. It's amazing the damn thing is still passable. The mere thought of the original builders of the tunnel made Kenneth wince. Numbers were always inferior, but numbers who came from areas 2 through 9 were at times almost good enough to pass as Britannians. Yes, they were generally lazier, and generally lacked the keen martial value of true Britannians from Area 1, the homeland, but they weren't necessarily a bad sort. After in some cases centuries under the Britannian yoke, virtually every trace of their original backwards cultures had been corrected away, and the true imperial Anglican faith had spread to even the most isolated valleys and islands. Numbers from areas 10 through 15, on the other hand, were a different story. Taken together, the inhabitants of the Southeast Asian and the Pacific territories west of Area 7 were stupid, ungrateful, and intemperate brutes who couldn't figure out how to handle even the most simple tasks. The notable exception to this rule were, of course, the 11s. Kenneth's jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. He wouldn't even have to be out here wasting his time shepherding these damned trucks if it weren't for the 11s forgetting their place. Ever since that pack of bandits and rebels up north in Niigata had gotten lucky, defiance had leapt from one 11 to the next. The 11s had always been cut from a different cloth than the rest of the numbers, that much was clear. It was equally clear to Kenneth McPherson that this was not a good thing. The 11s, once the residents and citizens of a developed country, were cunning and sly where the 10s, the 12s, and the 13s were stupid, but they devoted every iota of that malicious intelligence towards creative malingering, sabotage, and outright defiance. Too cowardly to stand up and fight, the 11s preferred to conduct hit-and-run attacks whenever they emerged from their bunkers, as they had almost 2 weeks previous in Niigata. McPherson hated 11s. To his own discomfort, he found himself increasingly disliking the Viceroy Governor, Prince Clovis La Britannia, for his soft-hearted and gentle approach to the damnable natives. If only a real governor could somehow be appointed, this whole mess would be shipshape in no time, McPherson fantasized as he and his wingman exited the tunnel at the head of the convoy, someone like Princess Cornelia or Princess Maribel, or Princess Corinne. If not a royal, perhaps Lord Statfeld or Lord Farshaw. Hell, even that maniac Sir Bradley would be able to put these upstart numbers back in their place in days. Unlike Prince Clovis. Kenneth sighed. It had been such a disappointment, for himself and for his family, when he had been assigned to Area 11. Not only was the area a colonial backwater far from the glamorous and glorious battles waged against the European degenerates in Africa and the Atlantic, the province was also nearly impoverished, making profitable opportunities few and far between. The only export worth anything was the saccharidite, and that whole industry was locked far too tight for a small noble family like the McPhersons to get involved with. And on top of all of that, Kenneth was a nightmare devicer, a latter-day night atop a charger, the king of the modern battlefield. He'd ranked in the top 30th percentile back at the academy and had placed 23rd out of the 100 hopefuls during nightmare training. He knew he wasn't Knight of the Rounds material, but he was still a highly trained pilot. A killing machine piloting another killing machine. Instead of having the opportunity to prove that the training hadn't been wasted, not to mention any opportunity to prove that he would have earned his lieutenancy even if his father hadn't purchased his commission, Kenneth had been sent to Area 11. Far from any honorable combat where he could earn a true knighthood and perhaps even a fief to call his own, and in sleepy Nagano City, far from even the trivial rush of combat against 11 rebels. Kenneth was momentarily startled out of his increasingly dark ruminations as his nightmare jolted over a slight bump. He blinked, momentarily surprised to find himself rolling onto a bridge. Weren't we just in a tunnel? Turning his fact sphere back over his shoulder, he saw the tunnel disappear behind the hill the provincial highway curved around. Fortunately, he also saw both trucks and the tailing pair of nightmares bringing up the rear. With a rueful sigh, Lieutenant McPherson turned back around, chastising himself for losing track of time and place. He'd been more or less steering his frame by instinct, while his mind had wandered down the endless list of grudges and misfortunes he'd been forced to endure. Not that it really matters, Kenneth chuckled to himself as he looked down to check the digital map. 7 minutes to go. There's no 11 rebels out here. They're all up in Niigata. Pity that. And honestly, having a chance to actually kill a few number scum would have made this entire pain in the ass trip worth it. Kenneth had known that someone had to escort the trucks, considering the valuable cargo they carried, and had earned himself a few brownie points with the captain by volunteering for the job, but it was a painfully dull task. He might have been in command of the convoy, as was right and natural, but it wasn't like he could do anything fun with his newly gained and temporary command. If only some idiots tried to rush my squad with swords. Ah, that would liven the day up, for a few minutes at least. The Sutherland jolted again as the land spinners crossed the bump at the end of the bridge, and Kenneth thought unkind thoughts about the DPW. Some corruption was, sadly, a fact of life. After all, the gears always needed a bit of oil to turn. But between the lights back in the tunnel and the surfacing on this bridge, this is completely unacceptable. Sure, the highway was rural, but with the construction of the new forward base at Sakai, actual Britannians would have to use this road, not just honorary Britannians in numbers. As Senior Lieutenant Kenneth McPherson made a mental note to submit a formal complaint with his superior about the shoddy road maintenance provided by the DPW, he vaguely noticed a heat source appear in the extreme peripheral vision of his fact sphere's monitor. Before he could turn his nightmare's head towards the unexplained heat signature, Lieutenant McPherson suddenly found his wish for 11 rebels granted as a series of explosions resounded from somewhere behind him. An instant later, 2 anti-armor shoulder-launched missiles slammed into the sides of his pilot pod, smashing the thin armor and killing him instantly. April 18, 2016 ATB, Sakai, Nagano. 0536. Yuji shivered where he lay on his belly in the dew-soaked grass, as he had for the last half hour. Unlike the tremors of the last 30 minutes, his shivering had nothing to do with the wet cold soaking through his thin jacket from the sopping wet blanket draped over his shoulders and head. Now, Yuji shivered with excitement as the pair of nightmares leading the Britannian convoy rolled past the end of the bridge 200 meters east of his position. After 6 years, the first installment on Yuji's long-deferred vengeance was about to be paid. A part of Yuji, the part that burned with 6 years of grief and pain, desperately wanted to throw off the shroud dripping with river water, to rise to his feet and to open fire on the Britannians immediately. That part of him, which seemed to be down somewhere in his chest, next to the internal pocket sheltering the faded picture of his fiancée, folded and stained and kept safe from the water in plastic wrap, radiated throbbing heat throughout his core. That part of Yuji, wounded these 6 years, had impulsively lashed out again and again since he had lost her, seeking to hurt the uncaring world as he had been hurt. It was an old and familiar instinct, leaning into unreasoning anger as an escape from the crushing grief that brought him to his knees whenever he let himself think, let himself remember. That part of Yuji snarled and raved, but was now held back by what he pictured as a steel collar and chain leash. He had forged that collar and that chain, blow by blow and link by link, over the last 3.5 months of training. The trio of instructors, which had grown by one a week into the program, had helped him along the way, but ultimately it was his will that now contained his temper. His 4-month journey to this prefectural roadside had started not in Shinjuku, and not at the side of his long-dead fiancée, but rather in the smoldering honorary Britannian neighborhoods of the Tokyo settlement. Yuji had been having a good day of sorts when the call had gone out for able-bodied men eager for work. Thanks to the Rising Sun Association, he had a mostly full belly, and he had felt emotionally stable. At the very least, the black grief and the red anger weren't drowning out the world around him. So, Yuji had trudged into the settlement with thousands of other 11s, signed up with a work crew, and had been trucked over to the work site. It had been like taking a trip to the past, to the horrible days immediately following the conquest. The architecture of the burnt-out buildings was different, but the shattered windows and gutted rooms were all too familiar. Gulping back emotion and memory, Yuji had joined the rest of his crew in hauling rubble to the waiting dump truck. She had only been dead for a day, and it was December, so putrefaction hadn't had time to set in. Even if she had begun to rot, Yuji probably wouldn't have smelled her, considering the reek of burnt plastic and linoleum that filled the remains of the charred apartment building. Bet it was the smoke that got her, Yuji had thought, as he'd helped 2 of his new co-workers lift a chunk of fallen roofing material off the table the woman had crawled under. Her clothes had been scorched in places, but judging by her cyanotic face it hadn't been the heat that had killed her. The dead woman, whose body had been unceremoniously flung into the truck with the other burnable garbage, lingered with Yuji as he continued to work, and followed him back to Shinjuku. Honorary Britannian collaborator or not, the way she had tried to curl up under the table. An inquiry or two at the Rising Sun meeting hall had taken him to a back room, where Yuji had been politely grilled by two women as to his motivations, history, and goals. The older woman he had seen a few times at the meeting hall, but as far as he had known, she was just another volunteer helping the association distribute food to the starving people of Shinjuku. Hajime Tanya, on the other hand. He'd heard the rumors, of course, but it had been hard to believe that the scrawny half asking about his work experience had really taken 3 adults down in a minute using only her bare hands. 4 months later, those rumors no longer seemed the slightest bit absurd. And now, Yuji waited patiently for the signal from that same Hafu, albeit a bit less scrawny, a bit more muscular, and slightly taller, to arm the weapon laying next to him in the grass. The shoulder-fired missile launcher had only been issued to him that morning, and he had only had a chance to practice with similar launchers for a few hours before leaving on the mission, but Yuji wasn't concerned. The launcher had been designed to be easy to use, and the target would only be 20 to 30 meters away. And close is going to be more than good enough. A second later, the handheld radio clipped to his belt clicked twice as the second truck left the bridge. Moving carefully, Yuji twisted the base of the stout weapon, causing the inner tube to telescope out and lock in place. Rolling onto his side, he picked up the launcher and tucked it over his right shoulder before flopping back onto his belly, taking care to shelter the trigger button on top of the assembly. Any second now. The flanking pair of nightmares rolled off the bridge meters behind the second truck. Yuji focused on taking deep breaths, trying to calm himself. Any second now. Any second. The leading pair of nightmares were almost directly in front of him, the top of the pilot pod a meter or so below the edge of the hill cut he lay on top of. Yuji gulped, trying to force the wad of thick mucus and saliva down his suddenly constricted throat as the unit insignia painted in gold on the front of the closest nightmare glistened in the light of a rogue sunbeam. It's gotta be soon. 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 Suddenly, the lead truck seemed to jolt once, and then twice, and began to wildly fishtail across the road as the driver lost control of the truck. Yuji couldn't see it in the early morning light, but he was certain the truck had just rolled across the improvised spike strip he'd helped make, nails strung together with chicken wire and painted gray. Which means, the radio clipped to his belt let out a trio of blasts of static as the little Hafu hit the transmit button once, twice, and thrice from wherever she was hiding. Finally, the overlapping explosions of 4 missile launches slammed into Yuji's ears as the blanket cascaded down his back. He smoothly rose to one knee, blanket pooling over his trailing leg as he brought the rocket launcher down to bear on the nightmare below and in front of him. To his left and right, the other 4 members of his squad likewise knelt, though only the 2 comrades to his left had their fingers on the trigger buttons. Across the road, 5 other figures likewise pointed their launchers down into the roadbed below. From the corner of his eye, Yuji could see one of the trailing nightmares slam into the hillside, but ignored it. He had a job to do. Smoothly, squeezing not jerking, Yuji depressed the button on his launcher, supporting the tube as it bucked his hand. The backblast, joined by his 2 squad mates, was enough to shred the overgrown bushes behind him, but Yuji's eyes were glued to the nightmare immediately in front of him. The unguided missile had slammed into the broadside of the pilot pod, almost perpendicularly to the ground. Judging by the absolute devastation, at least one of the rockets fired by his comrades on the other ridge had gone a bit high and slammed into the other side of the same nightmare's pilot pod. It looked like some pair of giant hands had clapped the frame, caving in both sides of the lightly armored compartment and obliterating whatever and whoever had been inside. The stricken nightmare's wingmate had also been hit, but only by 1 missile and only glancingly, if Yuji was any judge. The back of the pilot pod looked like it had been smashed by some fiery mallet, and bulged inwards. The second nightmare outlived the first by only a few seconds. The operations leader had planned for a target surviving the initial barrage, and an instant later, the 4 insurgents who had held fire during the first salvo pushed their own launcher's buttons. The second nightmare ruptured, a fireball forcing itself from somewhere deep inside the monstrous device's guts as the Yggdrasil drive destabilized. The second truck, blocked from reversing by the burning ruins of the flanking nightmares, tried to run. The driver slammed to the left, trying to get around the immobilized bulk of the first truck, and had nearly made it around his unlucky companion when a small form half ran, half slid down the opposing slope. The tiny figure, blonde ponytail streaming like a banner behind her, raised the pistol clenched in her right and fired 2 shots through the driver's side window without stopping or slowing, before jumping on the running board. A moment later, the truck came to a complete stop, and first the driver, then the passenger climbed down out of the truck, hands in the air, and knelt on the road before the feet of Hajime Tanya. At the sight, Yuji finally let his discipline slip. Throwing his spent launcher to the ground, he raised both hands to the sky, and howled at the day's victory. Japan! Japan! Long live Japan! Death to all invaders! Death! He could barely hear himself over the ringing in his ears, but he was certain his comrades were baying alongside him as the nightmares, the symbols of Britannian domination over the might of Japan, burnt in the scorched roadbed below them. April 18, 2016 ATB, Sakai, Nagano. 0540. Rina sighed with exasperation as her squadmates hooted like a troop of macaques over their victory. She was tempted to chide them for the unprofessional display, for celebrating before the mission was well and truly completed, but she couldn't deny the joy that had surged through her as the last nightmare standing had been pummeled into the roadside loam. Besides, the broad-toothy grin Rina could feel spreading across her face would probably undermine any rebuke she tried to make. And there's nothing worse than being a hypocrite, Rina thought with amusement as she picked up her discarded blanket and started hauling it and the spent launcher towards the lumber yard where the Furude brothers, the designated drivers, had parked the vans. Except maybe being a Britannian. Rina met the Furudes in the parking lot as they filed out of the lumber yard's office building, along with the 4 employees of the yard's early shift they'd been keeping an eye on. Per orders from on high, the temporarily detained employees had been kept under supervision in the break room and given breakfast, but hadn't been permitted to leave the Furude's watchful gaze. "Hey, Rina, what's the news?" You, the elder of the Furude brothers, greeted her from the end of the little procession, releasing the handguard of his rifle as he waved. "We heard the signal over the radio, did it work?" "You know it, you." It was hard to retain even the slightest bit of professionalism as Rina dumped her armload of blanket and spent launcher into the van's trunk, turning with a grin towards her not at all handsome and cool comrade. They rolled right into it, and then boom. Rina couldn't help but make the explosion noise herself, just to really underline how amazing it had been to watch the 2 rear nightmares explode as the 4 comrades laying in the drainage ditches along the bridge had stood up and fired their missiles straight into the back of the pilot pods. As soon as the truck hit that spike strip, they were dead meat. You laughed appreciatively, and Rina couldn't help but notice how fetchingly the white headband with the red rising sun ringed in yellow contrasted with his shoulder-length black hair. Plus, she thought, noticing how his chest moved as he laughed, the training's been real good to him. "You know," Rina said, walking back towards the road, "and just happened to take a route that went directly past you and his charges. I managed to hit one of the Brit bastards myself. It was a beautiful shot, you, right in the side of the pod. Wish you'd been there to see it." Suddenly, he was only an arm's length away, and somehow he looked really good holding that rifle. The radios on news and Rina's belt suddenly crackled to life, making Rina jump with surprise. Flustered, she quickly looked away from you as she fumbled for her radio. To her growing consternation, she realized that Yu's little brother, Taka, and all 4 of the Japanese workers the brothers had been supervising were all staring at her and Yu with open amusement. "Yellow to Watcher 1, what's your status, and the status of the workers?" "Over." Rina stopped trying to grab her radio and instead took the opportunity to resume not her retreat, her return to the roadside. "You've got a job to do. It's very important," she reminded herself, doing her best to ignore how hot her ears felt as she heard the unmistakable sound of badly suppressed laughter behind her. "Watcher 1 to Yellow," Rina heard Yu begin to report as she turned the corner of the road and started picking her way down the road, stepping over and around scraps of the leading nightmares. "Everything is good here. Watcher 2 is getting his van fired up, and our guests have behaved themselves. Over." "Yellow to Watcher 1, thank your guests for cooperating and let them go. Warn them of probable retaliation, and ask them to spread word to their neighbors, then get ready to go. Over." Rina heard the tail end of the last transmission in stereo as she walked past Yellow, the tiny blonde's voice overlapping with the crackling output from the radio. Keeping her distance to prevent feedback, Rina circled around Commander Tanya and the line of men lying prone with their hands bound on the side of the road and clambered into the intact truck's cab through the passenger door. The military truck was somewhat different from the old panel truck that instructor Nagata had taught Rina how to drive as part of the classes, and she spent some time getting familiar with the layout of the dashboard. As she moved the seat forward and down, and adjusted the mirrors, a line of her comrades formed, hauling everything man-portable out of the immobilized truck and into any available space in the bed of her truck. The truck was still running, so she fortunately didn't have to worry about getting the engine warmed up. Up ahead and a few hundred meters down the road, Rina could see one of the vans driven by the Furude brothers pulling up to the small construction hut located near the junction, and the trio of comrades hastily hauling the machine gun, the tripod, and the ammunition boxes out from inside the hut. In the event that one of the trucks had made it past the spike strip and the other impediments, the machine gun nest had been a backup, ready to rake the driver's compartment and engine block with hundreds of rounds per minute. Rina felt sorry for them. The poor guys didn't even get to fire off a shot. We were just too good. Finally, as the bucket line of comrades hauling cargo broke up and after Tanya dealt with the Britannian prisoners, Rina's radio crackled back to life. Yellow to Red 2, head south from Hirotaki. We'll be using drop point D3. Confirm, over. Rina unclipped the handheld radio from her belt and pulled the folded map out from her shirt, unfolding it on the passenger seat as she used her other hand to transmit. Red 2 to Yellow, confirmed point D3. Over. Yellow to Red 2. Good. Get going. Skip is already on his motorbike heading east on 408. He'll meet you when you cross the Chikuma, and the rest of us will be following right behind you. Over. Rina nodded for a second, before remembering that she had been talking to Tanya over the radio and stopped. No time like the present, I guess, she thought, and put the truck into first gear. The heavily loaded vehicle shuddered into motion, and Rina carefully maneuvered her way through the debris of the ambush, cursing the somewhat sticky clutch as she finagled around the sprawled leg of the lead nightmare. Can't wait for this mission to be over, Rina thought, yawning as the sleepiness from so much early morning activity hit her as the adrenaline of action faded away. Wonder if we'll get a fun after party too, like after the last mission? We better. And we didn't even lose anybody this time, so the mood should be way better too. Buoyed by the thought, Rina hummed cheerfully as she turned right and headed south across the next bridge over the Chikuma River. True to Tanya's word, Scope, the lookout who had kept an eye from the bushes on the tunnel and had reported on the convoy's progress to Tanya, was waiting for her at the intersection with Prefectural Route 408, straddling his motorcycle. He waved to her, and she waved back through the shattered driver's side window, before he kicked his bike's motor back to life and swung out onto the road behind her. Rina continued along her way, taking care to drive carefully on the winding mountain roads as she did so. It'd be really embarrassing if I crashed the truck on the way to the drop-off point, she reasoned, as she kept a steady pace of 50 kilometers an hour as two white vans fell into the procession behind her and Scope. Besides, a treacherous and highly unprofessional voice laughed in her mind. It'll be impossible to get Yu's attention if you seize mission failure from the jaws of success. Clenching her teeth, Rina focused on the road and tried her best to forget that Yu was likely staring at the back of her truck from behind his own wheel. Fortunately for Rina, the drop-off went perfectly. Tanya must have radioed ahead, because almost as soon as she had pulled off the highway onto the small Forest Service road, two men stepped out of the trees. Leaving the truck running, Rina hopped out and waved at one of the men, who, she noticed, was wearing a uniform very much like Major Onoda's, only less worn-looking and minus the mud stains. Delivery courtesy of the rising sun, she chirped as she bowed slightly to the men, before making her way back towards Yu's van, a spring in her step. Mission accomplished. We're definitely gonna have a party after this. April 18, 2016 ATB, east of Mount Torikabuto, Sakai, Nagano. 0703. I stretched back as best as I could in the van's passenger seat, trying to ignore the irritating sensation of damp cloth sticking and pulling on my skin. Major Onoda, who claimed to be somewhat familiar with the sensory equipment of nightmare frames, had suggested the wet blankets as a way to conceal the presence of my ambush party from the thermal vision of the fact spheres. Onoda's suggestion had worked like a charm, dripping with river water from a quick immersion in the Chikuma. The squad of Sutherlands hadn't noticed anything until it was far too late. Likewise, Ogi's thoughts that, in order for the ejector mechanisms to work, the armoring on the pilot pods had to be light was proven entirely correct. My trainees had performed well in the aftermath of the ambush as well. The extraction process had been orderly and quick, and the handover of the Britannian truck crammed full of spare parts for Sutherland's and a variety of tools presumably related to nightmare maintenance had gone off without a hitch. Despite this generally positive performance on the part of my newly graduated trainees, there was still room for improvement. I would let the trainees enjoy their party, enjoy their victory, but Squads 2 and 3 would be paying dearly for their impromptu victory celebration tomorrow. I didn't know if push-ups would fully drive my displeasure at their lack of discipline in an active combat situation, but it would at least improve their upper arm and core strength. I'd been concerned that the JLF receivers would ask after the other truck, but neither of them had asked any questions over radio or in person. Of course, that didn't mean that front members higher up on the food chain wouldn't chastise me for the truck's loss at some later point. It was entirely possible that the JLF soldiers had left the pleasure of haranguing me over the unsatisfactory quality of work to Onoda, or perhaps even to the fabled upstart himself, Lieutenant Colonel Kusakabe. Truck or not, I was having a hard time seeing the mission as anything but a complete success. We had acquired key intelligence about the capabilities of the Sutherland's fact sphere, as well as the strength of the side and back faces of the pilot pod. The tactics that Ogi and I had devised, with Onoda's input, had proven workable as well, if only with the advantages of surprise and deliberately chosen ground. Not to mention that all 20 of the insurgents I had brought with me on this mission were returning alive and unharmed. Scope the motorcycle riding scout ranged ahead of our little procession heading north on area route 405, back up into Niigata. We were not, I had to remind myself, fully out of danger yet. It was still possible for us to be detected by Britannian helicopters patrolling for rebel activity, or for us to encounter a surprise checkpoint blocking the road. We're not safe until we're back home. Back home. It was a nebulous concept, home. I had lived at the school for just slightly longer than I had lived in Ogi and Naoto's apartment. Almost 6 months, put together. Admittedly, either location felt more like home than the one room in an apartment my mother had sublet, where we had lived together for years. Home. The sun flickered in and out between the overgrown cedars, extended boughs casting wide shadows in the morning light of a bright spring day. It would be, it seemed, a cloudless day, even up here in the mountains. I could only imagine how hot and steamy it would be getting at the school. In this one area, Shinjuku probably had the rustic environs of rural Gunma beat. The breezes coming off Tokyo Bay helped break up the worst of the spring and summer heat, although they did nothing for the humidity. I closed my eyes and leaned back in the passenger seat, tuning out the boisterous chatter from the trainees. They were chatting about the party they eagerly anticipated to celebrate their first mission, and their first victory. I smirked, enjoying the privacy of the front seat. I was certain that they would not be disappointed by the moonshine that Ogi had stocked up on, nor by the 2 pigs that he, Nagata, and a squad had liberated from a Britannian farm in Nakanojo. It had been almost 4 months since I had left Shinjuku. 4 months of hard work training the recruits, organizing supplies for all present, hammering out agreements and concessions with Onoda. The adrenaline rush of combat had almost been a vacation from the daily humdrum work, much as I hated to admit it even in the confines of my own head. Not much of a vacation for Sumire or Monabu. The school was reaching a point where the trainees no longer required my hands-on presence, in my estimation. The training cadre was doing an admirable job straightening out the second cohort, and the plan had always been to hand over control of the school's program to the cadre after the completion of the first cohort's training. The fly in the ointment, as was often the case, was Major Onoda. As a result of my agreement with the Major for his ongoing support, at least one ranking member of the Kozuki organization needed to remain on site, lest some urgent mission crop up. I was sure that Major Onoda would be properly apologetic for acting without authorization after the fact, but considering his superior's habitual disobedience towards his superiors, I wasn't inclined to trust the man or, for that matter, any member of the Kusakabe faction. It was truly an unfortunate state of affairs. Onoda's knowledge of the capabilities of Glasgow series fact sphere sensors had been just as crucial to the success of our nearly completed mission as the shoulder-mounted anti-armor weapons he'd funneled to the Kozuki organization. If I could just rely on the JLF to not stab me in the back, they would be a near-perfect partner. Such a pity about their apparent Gekoko addiction. At the same time, I couldn't stay tied down to the school indefinitely. The school was important, but so was Shinjuku, and I had always planned for my time away from the slum to be limited in scope. I trusted Naoto, Ino, and Callan, of course, but I had left Naoto and Ino in something of a holding pattern. As for Callan, I could only hope that she wasn't drowning under the combined weight of 3 distinct roles. I didn't have anyone else who could take her place in the aristocratic circles open to her by her blood and her name, nor her place as an up-and-coming journalist. Beyond that, Shinjuku was in the Tokyo settlement, in the very belly of the Britannian beast. As the summer heat truly set in, I could only imagine how the constant simmering tensions in the settlement would boil over. I doubted anybody had forgotten the Christmas incident, especially if the prince had doubled down on supporting the purists, as he had in the aftermath of the Shinjuku subway incident. I opened my eyes again, and smiled at the beautiful spring day under the still rising sun. I would find someone to delegate keeping watch over the school to, someone who could check an order while still leading the mandatory missions. The Tokyo settlement practically seethed with opportunities in my mind's eye. I had the makings of a small but well-trained and well-supplied army, and I had the makings of a plan to finally burn out the parasites who had burrowed deep into my people's guts. It's time to go home to Shinjuku.